The scream tears through the laboratory. It is not a scream of fear. It is something deeper, something primal, the sound a chrysalis might make if it could feel itself being unmade and reborn in the same agonizing instant. Steve Rogers is burning, not with fire, with light, with energy, with the fundamental rewriting of every cell in his body. The Vita rays cascade through the chamber in blinding torrents, and inside that metal coffin standing upright like a pharaoh's sarcophagus, a man who has never known strength is being introduced to power for the first time. His bones crack and reform. His muscles tear and rebuild themselves twice as dense. His heart, that weak, stuttering heart that has failed him since childhood, pounds with a fury it has never known, pumping blood that carries something new, something extraordinary, through vessels that expand to accommodate the flood. The serum is alive inside him. Dr. Abraham Erskine watches through reinforced glass, his aging hands, pressed flat against the observation window, his breath fogging the surface, his life's work, his redemption, his prayer made flesh. The frail young man he chose, not for his body but for his heart, is transforming into something unprecedented. "Shut it down!" someone shouts. A military officer, Colonel Chester Phillips, his weathered face twisted with alarm. "You're killing him!" But Erskine does not move. He cannot move, because he knows what the others do not. He knows that Stephen Rogers would rather die in this chamber than walk out of it unchanged. He knows that the boy from Brooklyn has been waiting his entire life to become someone who can fight back. The machines scream alongside Steve. The Vita ray projectors built by Howard Stark, that young engineering genius with oil-stained hands and a mind that outpaces his mouth, glow white-hot. The laboratory trembles. Sparks shower from overtaxed circuits. The gathered observers shield their eyes against the radiance pouring from the chamber's seams, and then silence. The machines power down. The light fades. Steam hisses from pressure valves, ghosting through the underground facility like the breath of something newborn. For a long moment, nothing moves. Then the chamber doors crack open with a pneumatic sigh, and Stephen Grant Rogers steps out into the world for the second time. He's not the same man who entered. The figure that emerges stands 6 feet tall. His shoulders span wide enough to block the light behind him. Muscles cord his frame like cables of braided steel, not the grotesque bulk of a strongman, but the refined, perfected architecture of an apex predator. His chest rises and falls with breaths that come easy for the first time in his 20 years of life. No wheeze, no rattle, just the clean, deep intake of lungs that finally work the way God intended. His eyes are the same. That is what Erskine notices first. The same pale blue, the same quiet determination, the same fire that burned even when the body housing it was failing. Good, Erskine thinks. The serum amplifies what is inside. Good becomes great, bad becomes worse, and Stephen Rogers, it seems, was always good. The observers erupt. Scientists rush forward with instruments. Military brass push through to inspect their investment. Howard Stark circles the reborn soldier with undisguised fascination, already calculating, already designing, already imagining the uniform this man will wear. But Erskine hangs back. He catches Steve's eye across the chaos. The old man smiles. A small, private thing. A father watching his son take his first steps. Steve smiles back. Neither of them sees the man in the observation gallery above. Neither of them notices the slight figure in the brown suit, his hand slipping inside his jacket, his fingers closing around cold metal. Neither of them knows that Hydra has been watching all along. Heinz Kruger is a true believer, a fanatic, a serpent in the garden of American ambition. He has waited months for this moment, embedded among the observers, playing the role of a State Department functionary while feeding intelligence to his masters across the Atlantic. His mission was simple: observe the experiment, report the results. But Hydra's orders changed when Dr. Erskine defected. The formula cannot be allowed to serve the Allies. If Hydra cannot have it, no one will. The pistol clears his jacket. Time fractures. The first shot catches Erskine in the chest. The old man staggers. His eyes go wide, not with pain, not yet, but with understanding, with the terrible clarity of a man who knows exactly what is being stolen from the world in this moment. The second shot takes him in the stomach. Steve is already moving. The new body responds before his mind can catch up, reflexes operating at a speed he has never experienced. He catches Erskine as the doctor falls, lowering him to the cold concrete floor while chaos erupts around them. "Doctor, doctor, stay with me!" Erskine's hand finds Steve's face. His palm is warm, wet. His blood is spreading across the floor in a dark tide, and his life is going with it. No words. Erskine has no breath left for words, but his finger rises, trembling, and taps Steve's chest. Once, twice, 3 times. Remember what I told you. Remember what matters. Then the light goes out of Abraham Erskine's eyes, and the only man who knew the complete formula for the super soldier serum dies on a Brooklyn basement floor. Steve does not have time to mourn. The gunman is fleeing. The assassin is escaping through the laboratory's upper levels, shoving past screaming technicians, racing toward a waiting vehicle. Steve runs. He has never run like this. His legs pump with mechanical precision. His lungs draw breath without effort. The corridors blur past him. He bursts through doors without slowing, taking them off their hinges. He erupts onto the Brooklyn street in time to see the Hydra agent hijacking a taxi. In time to see the vehicle's tires squeal as it tears away into traffic. Steve gives chase on foot. He weaves between cars. He vaults over the hood of a delivery truck. His bare feet pound against asphalt, and somehow, impossibly, he is gaining ground. The taxi cannot outrun him. Nothing can outrun him now. The assassin realizes this. The pistol emerges from the taxi's window, firing wild shots into the crowd. Civilians scream and scatter. A bullet grazes Steve's arm, the first wound of his new existence, a red line that will heal within the hour, but he does not stop. He reaches the taxi. His hand closes around the door handle. With a strength he is only beginning to understand, he tears the door free and hurls the assassin onto the pavement. Kruger rolls, comes up on his knees, raises his pistol for a final shot. Steve's fist connects with his jaw. One punch. The perfect economy of violence from a body that has become the pinnacle of human potential. Kruger goes down hard. The fight is over, but the victory is hollow. Steve drags the assassin up by his collar. "Who are you? Who do you work for?" The man grins through bloody teeth. His accent is thick, German, arrogant even in defeat. "Cut off one head," Kruger hisses, "and 2 more shall take its place." Then he bites down on something hidden in his mouth, a false tooth, a capsule, and white foam erupts from his lips as cyanide does its terrible work. Within seconds, the assassin is dead. The secrets die with him. Steve releases the body. It crumples to the street. He stands there in the middle of a Brooklyn afternoon, barefoot and bare-chested, covered in the blood of his mentor, surrounded by screaming civilians and wailing sirens, holding answers that have already rotted to silence. The formula is gone. Erskine is dead. The dream of an army of super soldiers has perished in the span of a heartbeat. There will be no others. There is only Steve Rogers. There is only Captain America. And the war is just beginning. But legends do not spring fully formed from laboratory chambers. They are built, brick by brick, scar by scar, breath by laboured breath. To understand the man who emerged from that Vita Ray crucible, you must first understand the boy who walked into it. You must travel back through the decades, past the war and the chaos, past the science and the serums, to a sweltering summer day in 1918, when the world was drowning in a different war, and a child was born who would one day save it. The 4th of July, Independence Day. Sarah Rogers lay in a narrow bed in a cramped tenement apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Her body racked with the final agonies of childbirth, her husband Joseph pacing the worn floorboards outside the door. The midwife worked by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again. Another bill unpaid, another small humiliation in a life built from them. When the baby finally came, he did not cry. The midwife slapped his back. Nothing. She cleared his throat. Still nothing. For one terrible moment, Sarah was certain she had brought a dead child into the world, that God had given her this final cruelty after so many others. Then, a sound. Not a wail, but a wheeze. A thin, reedy gasp as tiny lungs fought to draw air through passages that seemed determined to deny them. Stephen Grant Rogers entered the world fighting for breath. He would spend the next 2 decades doing the same. The doctors said he would not survive infancy. His lungs were weak. His heart murmured with an irregular rhythm that made the physicians shake their heads. He was too small, too frail, too fragile for this world. But Sarah Rogers was Irish, and Irish mothers do not surrender their children easily. She held her son against her chest and whispered promises into his wispy hair. Promises that she would protect him, that she would make him strong, that she would teach him to fight even when fighting seemed impossible. She kept those promises, every single one. Joseph Rogers was a good man, a simple man. He worked the docks when there was work to be had and stood in bread lines when there was not. He came home smelling of salt and sweat and cheap whiskey. But he never raised his hand to his wife or child. He told Steve stories about Ireland, about the old country, about ancestors who had stood against tyrants and oppressors for generations. The Rogers blood doesn't know how to quit, Joseph would say, bouncing his sickly son on his knee. We're too stubborn to die and too stupid to run. Steve believed him. He had no reason not to. But Joseph Rogers carried something darker than stories home from the Great War. He had served in the trenches of France, had breathed the mustard gas that crept through no man's land like yellow death, and the poison had never fully left his lungs. By the time Steve was 5 years old, Joseph was coughing blood into handkerchiefs he tried to hide from his wife. By the time Steve was 6, Joseph Rogers was dead. The funeral was small, a pine box, a priest who rushed through the prayers because he had 3 more services that afternoon, a widow in a black dress she had sewn herself, a boy too young to understand what death meant, only that his father was gone and was never coming back. Sarah did not cry, not in front of Steve. She saved her tears for the night when her son was asleep, when she could muffle her sobs in a pillow so thin it offered no comfort at all. The next morning she put on her nurse's uniform and went back to work. They moved to Brooklyn, a smaller apartment, a rougher neighborhood. The rent was cheaper, and Sarah needed every penny she could scrape together. She worked double shifts at the hospital, tending to patients with tuberculosis and influenza and all the other diseases that festered in the crowded tenements of the poor. She came home exhausted, her feet swollen, her hands raw from carbolic soap, but she always had time to sit with Steve, to read to him, to listen to his dreams. Steve dreamed of being an artist. He spent hours with pencil and paper, sketching the world he saw from the fire escape of their apartment, the pushcart vendors and the stray dogs, the children playing stickball in the streets, the old men arguing politics on stoops. He had talent. Everyone said so. His teachers, his mother, even the gruff Italian shopkeeper who let Steve draw portraits of his customers in exchange for day-old bread. But talent could not pay rent. Dreams could not fill bellies, and the Great Depression was swallowing America whole. 1929, the stock market collapsed. What little stability the Rogers family had managed to build crumbled overnight. Sarah's hours at the hospital were cut, then cut again. The bread lines grew longer, the soup kitchens ran dry. Men who had worked their whole lives stood on street corners selling apples for nickels they would never earn. Steve watched it all with eyes too old for his young face. He saw the desperation, the humiliation, the slow erosion of dignity that poverty inflicts on even the strongest souls. He saw men beaten down by circumstances beyond their control, and he swore, with the fierce, uncompromising conviction that only children possess, that he would never let the world beat him down. The world tried anyway. Asthma, scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, heart palpitations, high blood pressure, chronic colds that turned into pneumonia every winter, scoliosis that curved his spine and made him stand shorter than he should have, anemia that left him pale and weak and trembling, partial deafness in one ear from an infection that nearly killed him when he was 9. The doctors kept lists, pages of conditions and complications, each one a new way his body had found to betray him. They told Sarah her son would never live a normal life. They told her to prepare for the worst. Sarah told them to go to hell, maybe not in those words. She was too polite for that. But the fire in her eyes said everything her tongue would not. Steve learned to fight from his mother, not with fists, that came later, but with will, with the sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept what the world insisted was inevitable. Every morning he woke up was a victory. Every breath he drew was a battle won. And then there were the actual battles. Steve Rogers could not walk down a Brooklyn street without finding trouble, or perhaps trouble found him. He saw a group of older boys tormenting a stray cat, and he waded in with fists swinging. He saw a shopkeeper shortchanging an elderly woman, and he raised his voice until the whole block could hear. He saw a loudmouth spouting hatred about Jews and Italians and anyone else who did not fit his narrow definition of American. And Steve, 90 pounds soaking wet, barely able to breathe without wheezing, told him to shut his mouth. The beatings were frequent, savage, thorough. Steve kept getting back up. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Arnie Roth asked him once, dabbing blood from Steve's split lip with a handkerchief. Arnie was Steve's best friend, a Jewish kid from the next block over, quick with a joke and quicker with his fists when someone needed defending. They had met when Arnie pulled 3 older boys off Steve in an alley. They had been inseparable ever since. "Can't quit," Steve mumbled through swollen lips. "Wouldn't be right." Arnie shook his head. "You're going to get yourself killed someday, Rogers." "Maybe. But I'll die standing up." That was the code. Steve's code. Passed down from his father, reinforced by his mother, burned into his bones by every beating he took and every time he refused to stay down. You did not back away from bullies. You did not let cruelty stand unchallenged. You did not surrender your dignity, no matter how badly the world wanted to strip it from you. The world took Sarah instead. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, the same disease she'd spent years treating in others, finally found its way into her lungs. Steve watched his mother wither the way his father had. The coughing, the blood, the slow dimming of the light in her eyes. He sat by her bedside and held her hand and read to her from the books she had once read to him. "Promise me," she whispered in those final days, her voice barely audible above the rattle in her chest. "Promise me you'll always stand up. Promise me you'll never let them change who you are." "I promise, Ma," she smiled. That same smile that had gotten him through every fever, every beating, every dark night of the soul. Then she was gone. Steve buried his mother in a pauper's grave because that was all he could afford. He stood alone in the rain, 18 years old, orphaned, penniless, and sick in ways that medicine could not fix. The year was 1936. Across the Atlantic, a man named Adolf Hitler was building an army. Across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan was sharpening its swords. The world was tilting toward a war that would consume nations and reshape history. Steve Rogers did not know any of this yet. He only knew that he was alone, that the only family he had ever known was rotting in the ground, and that the apartment he returned to that night was cold and empty and silent. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where his mother had helped him with homework, where his father had told stories of Ireland, and he wept. But when morning came, he dried his eyes and went looking for work, because Stephen Grant Rogers did not know how to quit. The kid from Brooklyn never did. The newsreels changed everything. Steve sat in the darkened movie theatres of Brooklyn, admission cost a dime he could barely spare, and watched the world burn. The flickering black and white images showed German tanks rolling through Poland, showed the Luftwaffe raining fire on London, showed refugees streaming down bombed-out roads, their faces blank with the particular emptiness of those who have lost everything. He saw the rallies at Nuremberg, the forests of raised arms, the banners emblazoned with twisted crosses. He saw a madman screaming into microphones, whipping crowds into frenzies of hatred, and he recognized something in those images. He'd seen it before, on a smaller scale, in the alleys and streets of Brooklyn. The same cruelty, the same cowardice dressed up as strength, the same impulse to crush anyone deemed weak or different or unworthy. Bullies, that was what they were. Bullies with tanks and planes and armies. Bullies who had graduated from tormenting individuals to tormenting nations. Steve Rogers had spent his entire life standing up to bullies. He was not about to stop now. 1940. France fell in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment and dignity on the beaches. Hitler stood triumphant over most of Western Europe, and America watched from across the Atlantic, still clinging to the tattered fiction of neutrality. But Steve knew neutrality was a lie. You could not remain neutral in the face of evil. You either stood against it, or you stood aside, and standing aside made you complicit. He tried to enlist the day after his 22nd birthday. The recruitment station was crowded with young men eager to prove themselves, their voices loud with bravado, their bodies strong and capable. Steve waited in line for 3 hours, filled out the paperwork with careful precision, and presented himself for the physical examination. It took the doctor less than 5 minutes to reject him. Asthma, the physician said, checking boxes on a form. Heart arrhythmia, history of rheumatic fever, high blood pressure, scarlet fever as a child, possible chronic complications. Son, I'm sorry, but you're 4F, unfit for military service. Steve stared at the form, at the stamp that marked him as inadequate, at the single letter and number that reduced all his determination, all his courage, all his desperate need to contribute to a bureaucratic dismissal. There must be something I can do, he said. Some way I can serve. The doctor shook his head. Go home, son. Find a factory job. Buy war bonds. Leave the fighting to men who can handle it. Men who can handle it. Steve walked out of the recruitment station with those words ringing in his ears. He passed the other volunteers, the tall ones, the strong ones, the ones whose bodies had never betrayed them, and he felt the familiar burn of inadequacy. The same burn he had felt his entire life. But inadequacy had never stopped him before. He tried again. Different recruitment station, different borough. He listed a different address, a different medical history, hoping that somehow the paperwork would slip through the cracks. 4F. He tried again. Manhattan this time. He memorized the eye chart beforehand. He practiced breathing exercises to calm his asthma during the examination. 4F. He tried again. And again. And again. New Jersey. Connecticut. Paramus. Each time he was rejected. Each time he walked away with that same stamp on his paperwork, that same dismissal ringing in his ears. 5 times, 5 different cities, 5 identical failures. Most men would have given up. Most men would have accepted what the world was telling them, that they were not needed, not wanted, not capable of contributing to the great struggle unfolding across the ocean. Steve Rogers was not most men. He stood outside a recruitment center at the World Exposition of Tomorrow in Queens, watching the other volunteers file inside, and he felt something that might have been despair if he had let it take root. He was exhausted. His lungs ached from the long walk. His heart fluttered with the irregular rhythm that had plagued him since childhood. But he walked inside anyway. This time, he was not alone. Dr. Abraham Erskine had been watching Stephen Rogers for weeks. The old scientist, German by birth, American by choice, had fled his homeland 3 years earlier, carrying secrets that could change the course of history and guilt that would haunt him until his dying day. He had worked for the Nazis once, not willingly, but that distinction offered little comfort when he closed his eyes and saw what his work had created. Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull, a monster born from Erskine's early imperfect serum, a creature of pure hatred given superhuman strength to match its superhuman malevolence. Erskine had watched his life's work perverted into something obscene, and he had spent every moment since trying to atone. The Americans offered him that chance. Project Rebirth, a new serum, refined and perfected. A process that could create super soldiers to stand against the Nazi war machine. But Erskine had learned a terrible lesson from his failure with Schmidt. The serum amplified what was already inside. It did not discriminate between virtue and vice. It simply made more of whatever it found. A good man would become great. A bad man would become worse. The military wanted to select candidates based on physical prowess. They wanted the strongest, the fastest, the most aggressive soldiers they could find. They did not understand that strength without character was worthless, or worse than worthless. It was dangerous. Erskine needed someone different, someone whose goodness ran deeper than muscle and bone, someone who had been weak all his life and therefore understood what it meant to be helpless, someone who would never become a bully because he knew, intimately and painfully, what it felt like to be bullied. He found that someone in a Brooklyn recruitment station, arguing with a doctor twice his size. "Please," Steve was saying, his voice steady despite the desperation behind it. "I can fight. I know I don't look like much, but I can—" "Son, you've been rejected 5 times, the doctor interrupted, his patience visibly fraying. "Falsifying your enlistment documents is a federal crime. I could have you arrested." Steve's jaw tightened, but he did not back down. "Then arrest me. But I'm not leaving until someone gives me a chance." Erskine watched this exchange from the shadows. He watched the young man's hands, clenched into fists, trembling slightly but refusing to surrender. He watched the fire in those pale blue eyes, the same fire that had caught his attention weeks ago, when he had first begun observing this remarkable, stubborn, infuriating candidate. He stepped forward. "I think that will be all, Doctor," Erskine said, his German accent softened by years in America but still unmistakable. "I will speak with this young man privately." The recruitment officer looked ready to argue, but something in Erskine's bearing, the authority of a man who answered to generals and senators, made him think better of it. He gathered his paperwork and retreated, leaving Steve alone with the stranger who had just saved him from arrest. "Do you want to kill Nazis?" Erskine asked without preamble. Steve blinked, thrown by the directness of the question. "Is this a test?" "Yes." A pause. Steve considered his answer carefully. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from." Erskine smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible, but it carried the weight of years of searching. "There are already so many big men fighting this war," he said. "Maybe what we need is a little guy." He handed Steve a file. Inside was a single document, an enlistment form, already approved, already stamped. The classification read not 4F, but 1A, fit for service. "I am offering you a chance," Erskine continued. "Not a guarantee. The procedure is experimental, dangerous. There's a very real possibility you will not survive it. But if you do, if it works, you will become something this world has never seen." Steve looked at the form, at the approval that had been denied him so many times, at the open door to everything he had ever wanted. "Why me?" he asked. Erskine placed a hand on Steve's shoulder. His grip was gentle, almost fatherly. "Because a strong man who has known power all his life may lose respect for that power. But a weak man knows the value of strength and knows compassion." Steve met the old scientist's eyes. Two men from different worlds, different generations, different circumstances, but united by something deeper, by a shared conviction that strength without virtue was meaningless, that power without purpose was empty, that the measure of a man was not the body he was born with, but the choices he made with whatever body fate had given him. "When do we start?" Steve asked. Erskine's smile widened. "Tomorrow. Pack light." The next morning, Steve Rogers followed Abraham Erskine into a nondescript sedan and disappeared into the machinery of war. He left behind everything he had ever known, the Brooklyn streets, the tenement apartments, the graves of his parents, and drove toward a future he could not possibly imagine. Behind him, the world continued its descent into darkness. Ahead of him lay a laboratory, a chamber, and a transformation that would change history. But in that moment, Steve Rogers was simply a young man with a soldier's heart, finally given the chance to prove what he had always known. He was ready to fight. The laboratory existed beneath a lie. From the street, it appeared to be nothing more than a modest antique shop in the heart of Brooklyn. Dusty furniture in the windows, a faded awning, a proprietor who discouraged customers with surliness and inflated prices. But behind the counter, past the shelves of forgotten relics, a hidden door opened onto a staircase that descended into the earth. And beneath the earth, America was building its secret weapon. Steve Rogers spent a week in that underground facility before the procedure. 7 days of medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and the particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who view you as an experiment rather than a person. The doctors poked and prodded. The military officers observed from behind clipboards, making notes they never shared. Everyone looked at Steve like he was already dead, a sacrifice to science, noble, but ultimately expendable. Everyone except Erskine. The old scientist visited Steve's quarters every evening. They talked about art. Erskine had studied painting in his youth, before physics seduced him away from canvas and pigment. They talked about Brooklyn, Steve's neighborhood, his childhood, the mother he'd lost and the father he barely remembered. They talked about everything except the procedure that loomed over them both like a guillotine blade waiting to fall, until the final night. Erskine arrived at Steve's door with a bottle of schnapps tucked under his arm. Contraband, technically forbidden, but the old man had never been particularly concerned with regulations. He poured 2 glasses and settled into the room's only chair while Steve sat on the edge of his narrow cot. "Tomorrow," Erskine said, swirling the clear liquid in his glass, "you become a new man. But I want you to remember something." Steve waited. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you must promise me one thing." Erskine leaned forward, his eyes suddenly intense. Stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man. I'll try. No. Erskine shook his head. Do not try. Do. The serum. It amplifies everything that is inside. Good becomes great. Bad becomes worse. This is why you were chosen. Not because a perfect soldier would be invincible, but because a good man is incorruptible. He took a long drink, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confession. I have made this mistake before. Steve said nothing. He sensed that Erskine needed to speak more than he needed to be questioned. In Germany, before I fled, I was forced to work for a man named Johann Schmidt, head of Hitler's science division, Hydra. He was obsessed with power, with becoming more than human. He demanded I give him the serum even though it was not ready, even though I warned him of the consequences. Erskine's hand trembled around his glass. The serum worked. Schmidt became stronger, faster, nearly impossible to kill. But the process, it burned away everything human in him. His face melted into something monstrous. A red skull, like the devil himself had crawled up from hell and put on a uniform. And his soul... Erskine shook his head. Whatever darkness was inside him, the serum made it infinite. The red skull, Steve said quietly. He had heard whispers of the name, a Nazi boogeyman, a terror weapon that even other Nazis feared. Yes, my greatest failure, my greatest shame. Erskine met Steve's eyes. This is why I chose you, Stephen. Not because you are strong, because you are good. Because I must believe, that goodness can be amplified just as easily as evil. He raised his glass. To the little guys. Steve raised his own. To the little guys. They drank. The schnapps burned going down, harsh and medicinal, but Steve barely noticed. He was thinking about tomorrow, about the chamber, about all the ways this could go wrong, but mostly he was thinking about Erskine's words. Stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man. He made a silent promise to himself that night. No matter what happened in that laboratory, no matter what the serum did to his body, he would not let it change his soul. He would remain Steve Rogers, the kid from Brooklyn, the boy who stood up to bullies. He fell asleep with that promise echoing in his mind. Morning came too quickly. The laboratory was transformed. What had been a sterile medical facility was now a theatre of war. Military brass filled the observation gallery. Generals and senators, intelligence officers and weapons developers, all gathered to witness the birth of America's ultimate weapon. Armed guards stood at every entrance. Technicians scurried between consoles checking readings, calibrating instruments. At the centre of it all stood the chamber, Howard Stark's masterpiece. The young engineer had designed it himself, working from Erskine's theoretical specifications, translating abstract science into gleaming steel and humming machinery. The Vita-Ray pods surrounded a central platform like the petals of some technological flower, each one capable of bombarding its target with concentrated radiation at frequencies never before achieved. Stark himself prowled the laboratory floor, barking orders at his technicians, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms smudged with grease. He was young, barely older than Steve, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem he could not solve. The Vita-Rays will activate the serum in your bloodstream, Stark explained as Steve was led to the chamber. Without them, the formula is inert. With them, well, we're about to find out. Colonel Chester Phillips stood nearby, his weathered face carved from skepticism. He had opposed Steve's selection from the beginning, had wanted a real soldier, someone with combat experience and physical prowess. He looked at Steve now the way a man might look at a racehorse with a broken leg, with pity, but also with the cold calculation of someone who had already written off his investment. "Are you sure about this, Erskine?" Phillips asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "He looks like a stiff breeze could knock him over." "I am sure," Erskine replied simply. Steve climbed onto the platform. Technicians strapped him in. His wrists, his ankles, his chest, his forehead. The restraints were padded but firm, designed to hold him in place during the transformation that was about to occur. Erskine approached. In his hand he held a syringe filled with blue liquid, the serum itself, the culmination of decades of research, the only sample in existence. "Stephen," he said quietly so only Steve could hear. "Last chance to walk away." Steve shook his head. "Let's get this over with." The needle slid into his arm. The serum entered his bloodstream, cold at first, then warming, then burning with an intensity that made Steve gasp. He could feel it spreading through his body, seeping into his muscles, his bones, his organs, not changing them, not yet, but preparing them, priming them. The chamber doors began to close. "Beginning Vita-Ray exposure," Stark announced. "Mr. Rogers, this might sting a little." The pods hummed to life. Light filled the chamber. Brilliant, searing, impossible to look at directly. The radiation poured into Steve from every direction, activating the serum, triggering the cascade of cellular transformation that Erskine had spent his life perfecting. Steve screamed. It was not pain exactly, or rather it was pain beyond pain, so intense that it transcended the body's ability to process it. Every cell in his system was being rewritten. Every fibre of muscle was tearing apart and rebuilding itself stronger. His bones cracked and reformed. His heart stopped, restarted, stopped again, then thundered back to life with a fury it had never known. In the observation gallery, someone shouted to shut it down. Steve heard the words as if from a great distance, muffled by the roaring in his ears and the light blazing behind his eyes. "No!" he managed to scream. "Don't! I can do this!" Erskine held up his hand, stopping the technicians from pulling the plug. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the chamber's readings, but he did not waver. The light intensified. The hum became a shriek. The chamber itself seemed to groan under the strain of forces it was barely designed to contain. And then, silence. The pods powered down. The light faded. Steam hissed from pressure valves as the chamber doors cracked open with a pneumatic sigh. Steve Rogers stepped out. He stood 6 feet tall. His shoulders spanned wide enough to block the light behind him. Muscles corded his frame like cables of braided steel, not grotesque, but refined, perfected, the absolute pinnacle of human potential. He drew a breath, and for the first time in his life his lungs did not struggle. "We did it," Erskine whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My God, we did it." The room erupted. Scientists rushed forward with instruments. Military officers pushed through to inspect their investment. Howard Stark circled Steve with undisguised fascination, already calculating the implications. No one noticed the man in the observation gallery reaching for his pistol. No one noticed the Hydra agent taking aim. The first gunshot shattered the celebration. Erskine staggered, a red bloom spreading across his chest. The second shot caught him in the stomach. Steve caught him as he fell. He lowered the old scientist to the concrete floor, cradling him like a child, watching the life drain from the eyes of the only man who had ever truly believed in him. Erskine's finger rose, trembling, weak. He tapped Steve's chest, once, twice, 3 times. "Remember what I told you. Remember what matters." Then Abraham Erskine died, and the formula died with him. Steve's pursuit of the assassin was automatic, instinctive. His new body responded before his mind could catch up, carrying him through corridors and up staircases and out onto Brooklyn streets where the Hydra agent fled in a stolen taxi. He caught him. Of course he caught him. But Kruger's cyanide capsule robbed Steve of answers, and the last link to Hydra's infiltration dissolved in white foam and convulsions. Steve stood alone on a Brooklyn street surrounded by screaming civilians, the blood of his mentor still drying on his hands. The program had been designed to create an army. Instead, it had produced a single soldier, unique, irreplaceable, the only super soldier the world would ever know. The formula was lost. Erskine was dead. And Steve Rogers was just beginning to understand the weight of what he had become. The world's only super soldier spent his first months of service selling war bonds. It was not what Steve had imagined, not what he had endured the chamber for, not what Erskine had died for. But the military brass looked at Stephen Rogers and saw something far more valuable than a weapon. They saw a symbol, a propaganda tool, a dancing monkey in red, white and blue. Senator Brandt approached Steve 3 days after Erskine's assassination. The politician's smile was wide and practiced, the smile of a man who had spent decades selling lies to voters and had grown comfortable with the taste of them. "Son, you've got something special," Brandt said, clapping Steve on the shoulder. "The American people need hope right now. They need to believe we can win this thing. And you, well, You're living proof that we can turn weakness into strength." "I want to fight," Steve said. "I enlisted to fight. And you will. You'll fight on the most important battlefield of all, the home front. Every bond you sell puts another bullet in a soldier's rifle. Every rally you hold reminds folks why we're in this war." Brant's smile widened. "Besides, you're the only super soldier we've got. Can't risk losing you to some Nazi sharpshooter before we've figured out how to make more of you." Steve wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he had not been transformed into the pinnacle of human potential just to stand on stages and read scripts. But Brant was a senator, and Steve was still technically a private, and the military had made it abundantly clear that his preferences were irrelevant. So Steve Rogers put on the costume and became Captain America. The suit was ridiculous. Bright blue spandex with red and white stripes across the midsection, a cowl that covered his head but left his face exposed, wings painted on the temples like some patriotic Hermes, a triangular shield, the first iteration made of simple steel, that looked impressive but would not stop anything larger than a thrown tomato. The USO tour launched in the spring of 1942. Steve travelled from city to city, performing in theatres and auditoriums and civic centres, flanked by showgirls dressed as the Star-Spangled Singers. The act was carefully choreographed. Captain America would stride onto stage, flex his new muscles, deliver speeches written by men who had never seen combat, and pretend to punch Adolf Hitler in the face while the audience cheered. "The Star-Spangled Man with a plan," the posters proclaimed. "Buy war bonds and back the attack." Steve smiled through every performance. He shook hands with donors and posed for photographs and signed autographs for children who looked at him with the particular wonder reserved for heroes. He told himself it mattered, that the bonds he sold were funding the war effort, that the morale he boosted was worth something. But every night, alone in whatever hotel room the tour had deposited him in, he stared at the ceiling and wondered what Erskine would think if he could see his creation now. Not a soldier, a showman, a dancing monkey in a flag. The tour crossed the Atlantic in November. The USO had decided that the troops needed Captain America more than the civilians did, that soldiers freezing in foxholes and dying in trenches would benefit from a reminder of what they were fighting for. Steve performed his first European show at a base camp in Italy, 5 miles behind the front lines. The audience was different here. No excited children, no eager civilians, just exhausted men in mud-caked uniforms, their eyes hollow with the particular emptiness of those who had seen too much death and expected to see more. They did not cheer. They did not applaud. They sat in sullen silence as Steve went through his routine, and when he raised his prop shield and proclaimed that they would triumph over tyranny, someone in the back shouted what everyone else was thinking. "Get off the stage, you chorus girl." The laughter was bitter, mocking. The sound of men who had buried friends that morning and would bury more tomorrow, forced to watch some propaganda puppet prance around in tights. Steve fled the stage before the act was finished. He found himself sitting alone on an equipment crate, rain pattering against the canvas tent above him, the distant rumble of artillery providing a soundtrack to his humiliation. This was not what he had signed up for. This was not why he had let them pump chemicals into his veins and blast him with radiation. He was supposed to be fighting, not performing. Supposed to be making a difference, not selling bonds. A woman's voice cut through his misery. That was quite a show. Steve looked up. Agent Peggy Carter stood before him, British, beautiful, and possessed of a spine made from the same steel as the tanks rolling toward the front. She was one of the few people in the military apparatus who had treated Steve like a human being rather than a specimen, and her presence now was either a comfort or a rebuke, possibly both. "Yeah," Steve muttered. "Real inspiring. Those men have been through hell." The 107th Infantry, what's left of them, came back from a mission 2 days ago. They lost half their number behind enemy lines. The rest are still out there, captured, presumed dead. Steve's head snapped up. "The 107th? That's Sergeant James Barnes's unit. Yes, I know you two were friends before the war." Bucky. The name hit Steve like a physical blow. Bucky Barnes, the kid from Brooklyn who had stood beside Steve through every beating, every illness, every dark night of the soul. The closest thing Steve had to a brother. He had shipped out 6 months before Steve's transformation, had been fighting in Italy while Steve was performing in theatres, and now he was missing, captured, presumed dead. "Where?" Steve demanded. Where are they being held? Peggy hesitated. A Hydra facility, 30 miles behind enemy lines. Colonel Phillips submitted a rescue request, but command denied it. They say it's too dangerous, that the men are already lost. Then I'll go myself. Steve, that's suicide. It's a fortified base. Hundreds of Hydra soldiers. I'd be walking into a fight. Steve stood, and for the first time since the chamber, he felt like himself again. That's all I've ever wanted, a chance to fight. He was gone before Peggy could stop him. What followed was the stuff of legend. Steve Rogers, armed with nothing but his ridiculous costume, his prop shield, and a stubborn refusal to accept the impossible, crossed 30 miles of Nazi-occupied territory on foot. He infiltrated a Hydra weapons facility the size of a small city. He freed over 400 prisoners, including what remained of the 107th Infantry. And he found Bucky Barnes, strapped to a table in a laboratory, barely conscious, muttering his name, rank and serial number through cracked lips. "Bucky!" Steve's voice broke. "Bucky, it's me! It's Steve!" Bucky's eyes focused slowly. Confusion gave way to disbelief. "Steve? Steve Rogers?" A weak laugh rattled from his chest. "What happened to you?" "I joined the army. The escape was chaos. Alarms and gunfire, explosions and collapsing catwalks." Steve faced Johann Schmidt himself in that facility, saw for the first time the crimson horror that had been born from Erskine's stolen serum. The Red Skull, the devil in a Nazi uniform. They fought briefly, brutally, before Schmidt fled, and the facility began to tear itself apart. Steve led the prisoners home. 400 men marching through enemy territory, armed with stolen weapons and impossible hope, following a showman who had finally become a soldier. Colonel Phillips was waiting when they arrived. "I should have you court-martialed," the colonel growled, but there was something new in his eyes, something that might have been respect. "You disobeyed direct orders, went AWOL, risked the entire war effort on a suicide mission." "Yes, sir." "And you saved 400 men." Phillips shook his head slowly. "Damn fool thing to do. Damn fool thing." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the war, Captain." Howard Stark provided the new shield 3 days later, a circular disc forged from vibranium, the rarest metal on Earth. The substance absorbed all kinetic energy directed at it. Bullets, explosions, the force of a charging tank. Nothing could penetrate it, nothing could damage it. In Steve's hands, it was both impenetrable defense and devastating weapon. The costume evolved too. The spandex gave way to armored fabric. The wings were painted on the helmet. The colors remained red, white, and blue, but now they were the colors of a combat uniform rather than a stage outfit. Captain America was no longer a propaganda tool. He was a soldier, and the war was about to feel his fury. The official designation came through within the week. Steve Rogers received a battlefield commission, Captain, United States Army, along with authorization to form and lead a special operations unit. No more USO tours, no more dancing. He would answer directly to Colonel Phillips and the Strategic Scientific Reserve, conducting missions too dangerous and too important for conventional forces. His first recruits were the men he had rescued from the Hydra facility, soldiers who had seen him walk through fire to save them, soldiers who would follow him anywhere. The Howling Commandos, they would come to be called, the most decorated unit in the European theatre, led by the kid from Brooklyn who had finally found his war. Captain America was extraordinary, but he was not alone. The war had awakened something in the world, forces beyond the comprehension of ordinary soldiers, powers that defied the neat categories of military science. The Nazis had their own program of superhuman development, churning out monsters and madmen from laboratories scattered across occupied Europe. If the Allies were to survive, they would need more than tanks and planes and the courage of common men. They would need legends. The invaders came together not through careful planning, but through the chaos of war itself. Circumstance and necessity forged them into a unit, and shared purpose kept them together long after circumstance had run its course. Name of the Submariner was the first. He emerged from the depths of the Atlantic like a god of ancient myth. Pointed ears, winged ankles, skin that gleamed with an inhuman pallor. Prince of Atlantis, son of a human sea captain and a princess of the deep. He had every reason to despise the surface world. His kingdom had suffered from humanity's pollution, humanity's wars, humanity's endless capacity for destruction. But the Nazis had attacked Atlantean outposts, had killed his people, and Neymer's rage demanded satisfaction. He fought alongside the Allies not out of love but out of vengeance. His arrogance was legendary. He considered himself superior to every human he encountered, and he was not shy about expressing this opinion. He clashed with military commanders, ignored orders that did not suit him, and treated the war as his personal crusade rather than a collective effort. But in battle, he was devastating. Superhuman strength that rivaled Steve's own. The ability to breathe underwater and withstand crushing depths. Flight granted by the tiny wings on his ankles. Neymer could sink a U-boat with his bare hands, could tear through a battalion of soldiers like a scythe through wheat. Steve respected him, even liked him in a strange way. Beneath the arrogance was a man who cared deeply about his people, who had set aside his contempt for humanity to protect those he loved. That was something Steve understood. The original Human Torch was something else entirely. Jim Hammond was not human. He was an android, an artificial man created by the scientist Phineas Horton, designed to mimic human life in every detail. But something had gone wrong, or perhaps something had gone impossibly right. When Hammond was exposed to oxygen, his synthetic body burst into flames. Not painful flames, but controlled fire that he could shape and direct at will. Horton had considered his creation a failure, a danger. He had sealed Hammond away, buried him in concrete, tried to forget the miracle he had accidentally achieved. But Hammond escaped. He learned to control his flames, and when the war came, he chose to use his terrible gift in service of the country that had tried to destroy him. There was a nobility to Hammond that Steve found deeply moving. The android had every reason to resent humanity, had been treated as a monster, a weapon, a thing rather than a person. Yet he fought to protect human lives. He believed in justice, in freedom, in all the ideals that Steve himself held sacred. In many ways, Hammond was more human than the humans who feared him. Toro, Thomas Raymond, was Hammond's partner and protege. A young man who had discovered his own flame powers after exposure to the same chemicals that had created the Human Torch. Where Hammond was measured and thoughtful, Toro was impulsive and eager, desperate to prove himself in a war that seemed determined to leave him behind. Steve saw something of his younger self in Toro, the same stubborn courage, the same refusal to accept his limitations. And then there was Bucky. James Buchanan Barnes had been at Steve's side since that Hydra facility in Italy. The bond between them had only deepened in the months of combat that followed. Forged in foxholes and tested under fire, tempered by shared trauma and mutual sacrifice, Bucky was more than a sidekick. He was a partner, a brother, the one person in the world who remembered Steve as he had been before the serum and who loved him regardless of which body he wore. Together, these five formed the core of the Invaders, the first superhero team, though the term had not yet been invented. They answered to no single command structure. They operated across theatres, deployed wherever the threat was greatest. European forests and Pacific islands, Arctic installations and African deserts. Wherever Hydra's tentacles reached, the Invaders followed. The Howling Commandos fought alongside them on countless missions. Sergeant Nick Fury led that unit, a cigar-chomping warrior from Hell's Kitchen who had seen too much death to be impressed by anything, and yet somehow remained impressed by Captain America. Fury's commandos were specialists. Dum Dum Dugan with his bowler hat and demolitions expertise, Gabe Jones with his languages and communication skills, Jim Morita, Jacques Dernier, James Montgomery Falsworth. Men from different nations and backgrounds, united by their willingness to follow Steve Rogers into the mouth of hell itself, they faced enemies that would have seemed impossible before the war. Master Man, Wilhelm Lohmer, a Nazi agent enhanced by a variant of Erskine's stolen formula, possessed of superhuman strength and fanatical devotion to Hitler's vision. Warrior Woman, Julia Koenig, Master Man's counterpart, equally powerful and equally devoted to the Reich. Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, aristocrat soldier, leader of Hydra's most elite forces, a man who seemed to survive every defeat and return stronger than before. The battles were brutal. Steve had thought he understood violence from his years in Brooklyn alleys, but the scale of industrial warfare defied comprehension. He saw villages burn to ash, saw prisoners executed in ditches, saw the machinery of genocide operating with terrible efficiency across occupied Europe. He saw things that haunted him for the rest of his existence, but he did not break, did not surrender to despair, did not allow the horror to transform him into the very thing he was, fighting against. He held to his principles with the same stubborn determination that had defined him since childhood, believing that the war could be won without sacrificing the ideals that made victory worth achieving. It was not easy. The calculus of combat demanded impossible choices: send men to die so others might live, destroy a bridge and strand civilians in enemy territory, prioritize military targets while innocents suffered. Every mission carried its own moral weight, and Steve felt each one accumulate in his soul like stones dropped into deep water. Bucky helped shoulder that burden. He took on the missions Steve could not be seen performing, the assassinations, the sabotage operations, the morally grey work that would have tarnished Captain America's symbol. He did it without complaint, without hesitation, because he understood what Steve represented and what it would cost if that representation were compromised. Steve knew, he always knew, and the guilt of sending his best friend into darkness while he remained in the light was another stone added to the collection. But the war demanded sacrifices. The war consumed everything it touched and asked for more, and the invaders gave what was asked, mission after mission, year after year, pushing back against the tide of fascism one bloody inch at a time. The camaraderie sustained them, the jokes shared in quiet moments, the arguments that flared and faded, Namer's endless complaints about surface-dweller incompetence, Hammond's patient philosophical discussions about the nature of humanity and what it meant to be alive, Toro's youthful enthusiasm, unquenched despite everything he had witnessed, Bucky's dark humour, his ability to find something to laugh about even in the worst circumstances. They were family, not by blood, but by choice, by the bonds forged in foxholes and sealed in shared trauma, by the simple fact that they had stood together against impossible odds and survived. The propaganda value was immense, of course. Newsreels showed Captain America leading charges against Nazi fortifications. Posters depicted the invaders standing triumphant over defeated enemies. The American public and the Allied nations needed symbols to believe in, and the invaders provided those symbols in abundance. But the real value was on the battlefield. The invaders turned the tide of engagements that should have been losses. They rescued prisoners from camps that conventional forces could not reach. They destroyed weapons facilities that threatened to shift the balance of the war. They gave hope to soldiers who had forgotten what hope felt like. By 1945, the end was in sight. The Allies had landed at Normandy. The Soviet forces were pushing from the east. Hitler's Reich was collapsing, its 1,000-year ambitions crumbling after barely more than a decade. But Hydra remained. The Red Skull remained. And the war's final chapter would cost Steve Rogers more than he could possibly have imagined. The end was coming, and it would be paid for in blood. They met before the serum, before the shield, before Captain America existed as anything more than a propaganda concept sketched on a government whiteboard. James Buchanan Barnes, Bucky to everyone who knew him, was 17 years old when he first encountered Steve Rogers. It was 1941, Camp Lehigh, New Jersey, and Bucky had just completed basic training with marks, high enough to earn him assignment to the camp's permanent staff. He was young, capable, and possessed of the easy confidence that came from a body that had never betrayed him. Steve was there as part of Project Rebirth's preliminary screening, still frail, still fighting for every breath, still getting into fights he could not win with bullies who outweighed him by 50 pounds or more. Bucky found him behind the mess hall, picking himself up from the dirt after 3 larger recruits had decided the scrawny volunteer made an easy target. Blood dripped from Steve's split lip. His eye was already swelling shut, but he was getting back up. Of course he was getting back up. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Bucky asked, offering his hand. Steve took it. "So I've been told." Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps. The sense that they were cut from similar cloth, despite their vastly different circumstances. Bucky saw in Steve the same stubborn fire he had always admired in the heroes of his childhood stories. Steve saw in Bucky the kind of easy strength he had always wished he possessed. They became inseparable. When Steve emerged from the Vita Ray chamber transformed, Bucky was one of the first to see him. The shock on his face was almost comical. jaw-dropping, eyes widening, a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. "Steve, what the hell did they do to you?" "Made me taller," Steve replied with a grin. The friendship adapted to Steve's new circumstances, but its essence remained unchanged. They were still the same two men who had met behind a mess hall, one stubborn beyond reason, the other loyal beyond measure. The serum had not altered that fundamental equation. When Steve formed the Howling Commandos after the Hydra facility rescue, Bucky was his first and most essential recruit, not because of his combat skills, though those were considerable, not because of his marksmanship, though he could put a bullet through a Nazi helmet at 300 yards, but because Steve trusted him, completely, unconditionally. In a war filled with secrets and deceptions, that trust was more valuable than any weapon. Their dynamic evolved over months of combat. Steve was the symbol, the shield-wielding icon who charged into battle with the American flag on his chest, who inspired troops and terrified enemies, who represented everything the Allied forces claimed to stand for. He was hope made manifest, justice wrapped in red, white, and blue. Bucky was the shadow. The war required things that Captain America could not be seen doing. Assassinations of key Nazi officials, sabotage operations that violated the rules of engagement, interrogations that crossed lines Steve's conscience would not permit. The symbol had to remain pure. The war effort could not afford for Captain America to be tarnished by the moral compromises that victory demanded. So Bucky did what Steve could not. He slipped behind enemy lines alone, silent as a ghost, and returned with blood on his hands and intelligence in his pocket. He put bullets in the heads of men who would never see a trial. He did the dark work, the dirty work, the necessary work, and he never complained, never hesitated, never asked Steve to share the burden. Steve knew, he always knew, and the knowledge carved something hollow in his chest that he could never quite fill. "You don't have to do this," he told Bucky once, in the quiet hours before a mission that would require Bucky to eliminate a Hydra scientist before the man could complete his research. "I can find another way. We can capture him, bring him back for..." "For what?" Bucky interrupted. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were hard. "A trial? You think there's going to be trials for all of them? You think the world has time for that kind of justice? There has to be a better way. Maybe, but right now, there's this way, and this way keeps you clean." Bucky's hand found Steve's shoulder. "That matters, Steve. What you represent, that matters. You give people something to believe in. You can't do that if you're wading through the same mud as the rest of us." "I don't want to be clean if it means you have to be dirty," Bucky smiled. That crooked, careless smile that had charmed half the nurses in the European theatre. "Someone's got to do it. Might as well be me." He left that night. He came back 3 days later with haunted eyes and a mission report that contained no details Steve wanted to know. They never spoke of it again, but the bond between them deepened with every shared horror. They saved each other's lives so many times that counting became pointless. Bucky pulled Steve from a burning tank in Belgium. Steve carried Bucky 3 miles through enemy territory after a sniper's bullet shattered his leg. They bled together, froze together, starved together. They watched friends die and enemies fall and civilians suffer, and through it all they held on to each other like drowning men clutching driftwood. The other commandos noticed. How could they not? The way Steve's eyes found Bucky first after every engagement, checking for injuries, confirming survival. The way Bucky positioned himself at Steve's 6 during firefights, watching angles the shield could not cover. The wordless communication between them, gestures and glances that conveyed more than sentences could manage. "You two share a brain or something?" Dum-Dum Dugan asked once after watching Steve and Bucky execute a flanking maneuver that should have required minutes of planning but had been improvised in seconds. "Something like that," Steve replied. The missions blurred together, France and Belgium and Germany and Austria, forests and mountains and cities reduced to rubble. Each operation chipped away at something. Innocence, perhaps, or the comfortable illusion that war could be fought cleanly. Bucky laughed less as the months wore on. His jokes grew darker, his silences grew longer. Steve watched his best friend disappear by inches and did not know how to stop it. "After the war," Steve said one night, huddled in a bombed-out farmhouse while snow fell outside, "what do you want to do after all this is over?" Bucky stared into the flames of their small fire. The light carved shadows into his face, making him look older than his 26 years. "I don't think about after," he said quietly. "Feels like bad luck. Come on. There has to be something. A girl back home, a job. You want?" A long pause. When Bucky spoke again, his voice was barely audible above the crackling fire. "I used to think about teaching. Can you believe that? Me, standing in front of a classroom trying to explain history to kids who don't give a damn." He laughed. A hollow sound. "Now I can't imagine it. Can't imagine being anywhere that isn't this. Can't imagine being anyone who hasn't done what I've done." Steve's hand found Bucky's arm, gripped tight. "You're still you," he said. "Underneath all of it. You're still the guy who helped a skinny kid up from the dirt behind a mess hall. That doesn't go away. Doesn't it?" "No." Steve's voice was fierce, certain. "It doesn't. And when this war is over, I'm going to prove it to you. We'll go back to Brooklyn, get an apartment, figure out what normal feels like." Bucky met his eyes. For a moment, something like hope flickered in his expression. Fragile, uncertain, but present. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay. Brooklyn." They shook on. A promise between brothers, a future worth fighting for. Neither of them knew that future would never come. The war was entering its final months. The Reich was crumbling, and Hydra was preparing one last desperate gambit, a drone plane loaded with explosives aimed at the American heartland, capable of killing millions. The mission to stop it would be Steve and Bucky's last, but they did not know that yet. They only knew that the fire was warm, the snow was falling, and for one quiet moment in the middle of hell, they were together. It would have to be enough. Every hero requires a villain worthy of their measure, a dark reflection, a twisted mirror that shows what they might have become if circumstance had carved them differently. For Captain America, that mirror wore a face of crimson horror and called itself the Red Skull. Johann Schmidt was born in a village in Germany so small it barely warranted a name on any map. The year was 1875, though the precise date was never recorded. His mother died in childbirth, and his father, a drunkard consumed by grief and rage, blamed the infant for her death. The midwife who delivered Johann considered smothering him in his crib. A mercy, she thought, better than the life that awaited him. She did not. Perhaps she should have. Johann's childhood was a masterwork of cruelty. His father beat him for crying, beat him for not crying, beat him for existing, for breathing, for being a constant reminder of the woman whose death he could not forgive. The boy learned early that the world was divided into two categories, those who inflicted pain and those who received it. He resolved to never again be among the latter. He ran away at 7 years old, survived on the streets of Munich then Berlin, stole food, stole clothes, stole whatever he needed to survive another day. He worked as a bellhop in hotels, as a labourer in factories, as a servant in the homes of the wealthy. He observed how power operated, how the strong dominated the weak, how cruelty was rewarded while compassion was exploited. He learned to hate. It was the only lesson the world seemed interested in teaching him. The Great War came and went. Germany collapsed into chaos. Hyperinflation, political violence, the humiliation of Versailles. Johann watched his country tear itself apart and felt nothing but contempt. The German people were weak. Their leaders were weak. They deserved their suffering because they lacked the will to seize what they wanted. Then he discovered Adolf Hitler. It was 1930, and Hitler was not yet the Führer, merely a rising politician with a talent for speeches and a vision of German supremacy that resonated with a broken nation. Johann attended a rally in Munich, pressed among thousands of other angry young men, and listened to the Austrian corporals scream about destiny and blood and the 1,000-year Reich that would rise from Germany's ashes. Something awakened in Johann that night. Not belief. He was too cynical for belief, but recognition. Hitler understood what Johann had always known, that the world belonged to those with the will to take it, that morality was a cage built by the weak to restrain the strong, that power was the only truth that mattered. Johann pushed his way through the crowd after the rally, found Hitler's handlers, demanded an audience. When they tried to turn him away, he grabbed one by the throat and lifted him off his feet with strength that surprised even himself. Hitler saw. Hitler was intrigued. The meeting that followed changed the course of history. Hitler recognized something in Johann Schmidt, a kindred darkness, a capacity for cruelty that matched his own. He took the young man under his wing, made him a protégé, oversaw his training personally, moulding him into the perfect instrument of terror. "You will be my greatest creation," Hitler told him. "The embodiment of everything we stand for. The face of fear itself, the face, would come later." First came the skills. Johann trained with the finest soldiers in Germany, learned combat and strategy, espionage and interrogation. He proved himself a natural leader, not through inspiration, but through fear. Men followed him because the alternative was unthinkable. He rose through the ranks of the Nazi apparatus with terrifying speed. By 1935, he commanded his own division. By 1938, he had been placed in charge of Hitler's most secret project, a weapons research division that would come to be known as Hydra. The name was Johann's idea. Cut off one head, and 2 more shall take its place. An organization that could survive any defeat, regenerate from any setback, outlast any enemy. Hitler thought he was building a weapon to win the war. Johann was building something far more ambitious. He was building an empire that would consume the Reich itself. But first, he needed power. True power. The kind that transcended politics and armies and the petty ambitions of men like Hitler. He found it in Abraham Erskine. The scientist had been working on the super soldier formula for years, a serum that could transform ordinary men into paragons of physical perfection. Erskine was a humanitarian. He dreamed of using his discovery to help mankind, to cure diseases and extend lives. He did not understand that he had invented the most dangerous weapon in human history. Johann understood, and Johann wanted it. He had Erskine brought to his laboratory, threatened him, tortured him, promised to murder everyone the scientist had ever loved unless he surrendered the formula. Erskine resisted at first. He was braver than Johann had expected, but everyone breaks eventually. Everyone has a limit. Erskine administered the serum. The process was incomplete, untested, dangerous beyond measure. The scientist warned Johann that the formula was not ready, that the results could be catastrophic. Johann did not care. The transformation was agony. Every nerve in his body ignited with pain that transcended language. His muscles tore and rebuilt themselves. His bones cracked and reformed. His mind expanded, filled with clarity and purpose that he had never known. But something went wrong. The serum amplified what was inside. Erskine had always known this, had always warned that the formula could not distinguish between virtue and vice. Johann Schmidt had no virtue to amplify, only hatred, only cruelty, only the endless, bottomless darkness that had been poured into him since infancy. His face melted. The skin sloughed away, revealing the musculature beneath. But it did not heal, did not regenerate into normal tissue. Instead, it scarred into something monstrous, a visage of crimson horror, a skull stripped of humanity, a face that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. Johann looked in the mirror and saw what he had always been. He smiled. "Red Skull," he whispered, testing the words. "I am the Red Skull." Erskine fled that night, escaped to America carrying the perfected formula in his head and guilt in his heart. The Red Skull let him go, a mistake he would later regret, though at the time he was too intoxicated by his new power to care about one fleeing scientist. Hydra expanded under the Skull's leadership. He built weapons factories across occupied Europe, staffed by slave labor and fueled by resources stolen from conquered nations. He developed technologies decades ahead of their time, energy weapons, armored vehicles, aircraft that could outfly anything the Allies possessed. He recruited scientists and soldiers, true believers and opportunists, anyone who could advance his vision of a world remade in Hydra's image. Hitler thought Hydra served the Reich. The Red Skull knew better. The Reich was a stepping stone, a means to an end. When the war was won, Hydra would devour the Nazi apparatus from within, and Johann Schmidt would rule over the ashes. Then Captain America appeared. The Red Skull learned of the American super soldier through intelligence reports, another product of Erskine's formula, another being transformed by the same serum that had created him. He was intrigued, amused, and for the first time in his existence curious. He arranged their first meeting deliberately. Let Captain America penetrate a Hydra facility. Let him believe he was rescuing prisoners through his own prowess. The Skull wanted to see this rival, this mirror image, this other half of Erskine's legacy. He was not disappointed. Steve Rogers stood before him in that burning facility, shield raised, jaw set with determination. The Red Skull saw immediately what Erskine had done, had chosen a subject whose goodness matched Johann's evil, whose compassion balanced his cruelty. The scientist had been trying to prove something, trying to redeem his failure. "You are Erskine's second chance," the Skull observed, circling Steve like a predator evaluating prey. "His attempt to correct the mistake he made with me." "I'm going to stop you," Steve replied. "I'm going to tear Hydra apart." The Skull laughed. It was a terrible sound, echoing through the collapsing facility. "You will try, and you will fail, because you do not understand what you are fighting." He gestured at his crimson face. "I have seen the truth that hides beneath the skin. I have embraced what you deny. We are the same, Captain. Products of the same science, the same ambition, the same formula. We're nothing alike. No." The Skull's lipless mouth twisted into something resembling a smile. "We shall see." Their battles spanned years. Italy and France and Germany, frozen wastelands and burning cities, laboratories and fortresses, and the broken ruins of civilization. The Skull deployed his sleeper robots, massive automated weapons designed to awaken after the war and continue Hydra's mission. Captain America destroyed them. The Skull sought the Cosmic Cube, an artifact of reality-altering power, and came within inches of claiming it. Captain America stopped him. Again and again they clashed. Neither could achieve final victory over the other. They were too evenly matched, too perfectly opposed, locked in an eternal struggle between light and darkness. The Red Skull became obsessed, not with winning. He was confident that victory would come eventually, but with understanding. He studied Captain America with the intensity of a scholar examining a sacred text. He analysed every battle, every decision, every moment of mercy that Steve displayed toward defeated enemies. He could not comprehend it, could not fathom how someone transformed by the same power, forged in the same crucible, could emerge so fundamentally different. Steve Rogers should have been his equal in darkness, should have understood that the strong exist to dominate the weak, should have embraced the truth that the serum revealed. Instead, he clung to compassion like a drowning man, clutching wreckage, refused to kill when killing would be expedient, protected the weak instead of culling them, acted as though human life had value, as though morality was anything more than a convenient fiction. It infuriated the Skull, and in some dark corner of his twisted soul it fascinated him. "You are the only man I have ever respected," he told Steve during one of their final confrontations, "and the only man I've ever truly hated." "The feeling's mutual," Steve replied, and raised his shield. The war ended before their rivalry could reach its conclusion. Germany fell, Hitler died in his bunker, the Reich crumbled into dust and occupation, but the Red Skull did not die with it. Cut off one head, and two more shall take its place. Hydra survived, burrowing into the shadows, infiltrating governments and corporations and intelligence agencies across the globe, and Johann Schmidt survived with it, preserved through technology and dark science, waiting in the darkness for the moment when he could emerge again. He would face Captain America many more times in the decades to come. Their war was not bound by the calendar of human conflicts. It was eternal, just as the Skull had always known it would be. April 1945. The war was dying, everyone could feel it, the particular exhaustion that settles over a conflict in its final days, when victory is assured but the killing continues anyway, when men die for ground that will be surrendered at negotiating tables, when the machinery of death grinds on through sheer momentum rather than purpose. Berlin was burning. Soviet forces pushed from the east while Allied armies closed from the west. Hitler had retreated to his bunker, raving about miracle weapons and final victories that existed only in his deteriorating mind. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing after barely 12 years, and its architects were scrambling to escape the justice that awaited them. But Hydra was not finished. The Red Skull had vanished, disappeared into the chaos of the Reich's collapse, presumably to continue his work from whatever shadow he had chosen for his next lair. His absence left a vacuum in Hydra's command structure, and into that vacuum stepped a man whose hatred of Captain America burned nearly as bright as the skull's own. Baron Heinrich Zemo. He came from Prussian aristocracy, old money, old blood, old cruelty refined across generations of privilege. His family had served German emperors for centuries, and Heinrich had inherited their conviction that certain bloodlines were born to rule, while others existed only to serve. The Nazi ideology had been a natural fit for his existing prejudices, and he had risen quickly through its ranks. But Zemo's true genius lay in science, not politics. He was a chemist of extraordinary ability, capable of synthesizing compounds that his peers could barely conceptualize. His laboratories produced weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, adhesives that could never be dissolved, metals that could never be broken, poisons that killed in ways medicine could not explain. His masterwork was Adhesive X. The substance was revolutionary. Once applied, it bonded permanently to any surface. Nothing could dissolve it. Nothing could break its grip. Zemo envisioned coating Allied vehicles with the compound, gluing tank treads to the ground, sealing aircraft canopies shut, transforming the enemy's own equipment into prisons. Captain America destroyed the primary production facility before the weapon could be deployed. The battle was brutal. Steve fought through Zemo's guards, smashed through his laboratory, sent vats of Adhesive X crashing to the floor. In the chaos, one of those vats shattered directly above the Baron himself. The compound splashed across Zemo's face. Across the hood he wore as part of his costume, a purple mask that covered his head completely, leaving only his eyes and mouth exposed. The hood bonded to his skin, permanently, irreversibly. The Adhesive X fused fabric to flesh, and no amount of surgery, no chemical treatment, no procedure known to science could remove it. Baron Heinrich Zemo would wear that mask for the rest of his life. His face forever hidden beneath purple cloth, his identity erased by his own creation. He blamed Captain America, not himself for creating the compound, not the fortunes of war for placing him in that laboratory at that moment. Captain America. The symbol of everything Zemo despised. Common birth elevated above noble blood. American arrogance triumphant over German superiority. A former weakling transformed into a weapon that had humiliated him beyond endurance. The hatred consumed him, became the organizing principle of his existence. He would destroy Captain America, would make the Americans suffer as he had suffered, would tear down everything the shield-wielding symbol represented, even if it cost him his life to do so. By April of 1945, Zemo had his opportunity. Hydra's final gambit was a drone plane, an unmanned aircraft loaded with enough explosives to level a city. The target was the eastern seaboard of the United States. New York, Washington, Boston. Millions of civilians who believed the war was nearly over, who had no idea that death was being prepared for them in a hidden airfield in the Alps. Intelligence reached the Strategic Scientific Reserve 3 days before the planned launch. The source was fragmentary, unreliable, obtained through channels that could not be verified. But the stakes were too high to ignore. Colonel Phillips summoned Steve to his command tent. "We don't have confirmation," Phillips admitted, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the table. "Could be a trap, could be nothing. But if it's real and that plane launches..." "Then we stop it," Steve said simply. "You and Barnes, small team, in and out before Zemo knows you're there." Phillips met Steve's eyes. "I won't lie. To you, Captain. This one feels wrong. The intelligence is too convenient. The timing is too perfect. Every instinct I have says we're being played." "Then we'll play back." The insertion was textbook. Steve and Bucky parachuted into the Alps under cover of darkness, landing 3 miles from the Hydra facility. They moved through frozen forests and rocky terrain, their breath misting in the bitter cold, their weapons ready for the ambush that never came. The facility was smaller than expected. A single runway carved into a mountain plateau, a hangar housing the drone plane, guard towers and bunkers, but fewer personnel than the intelligence had suggested. "I don't like this," Bucky murmured, scanning the perimeter through binoculars. "Where is everyone?" "Maybe they've already evacuated, war's almost over, rats leaving the ship. Or maybe they're waiting for us." Steve considered the possibility, weighed it against the millions of lives that hung in the balance. "We go anyway," he decided. Whatever's waiting for us, we handle it. Bucky nodded. He had known that would be the answer. Had known before he asked. They moved. The assault was swift and violent. Steve's shield sang through the air, bouncing between guards, disabling weapons, creating chaos. Bucky's rifle cracked in precise rhythm, each shot finding its mark. The Hydra soldiers fought with the desperation of true believers, but they were outmatched. Within minutes the perimeter was breached. The hangar doors stood open. Inside, the drone plane waited, a sleek, deadly silhouette against the mountain backdrop. Its engines were already warming, exhaust shimmering in the cold air. The launch sequence had begun. Baron Zemo stood beside the aircraft, his purple hood stark against the grey concrete, his eyes burning with triumph behind the mask he could never remove. "Captain America!" he called out, his voice carrying across the hangar. How predictable, how perfectly beautifully predictable. "It's over, Zemo. Step away from the plane." "Over?" Zemo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound muffled by the fabric fused to his face. "The war is over, yes. Germany is finished. The Reich is dust. But Hydra endures. And this plane, this beautiful instrument of vengeance, will ensure that your precious America shares our suffering." "I won't let that happen." "No, you will try to stop it. You will board that plane and attempt to disable the explosives or redirect its course. That is what heroes do, is it not?" Zemo's eyes glittered. "And when you do, you will discover that I have planned for every contingency, that this plane is my masterpiece, that I have finally created something you cannot defeat." He pressed a button on the console beside him. The drone's engines roared to full power. The aircraft began to roll forward, gathering speed, racing toward the runway. Steve ran. He sprinted across the hangar floor, legs pumping with superhuman speed, closing the distance to the accelerating plane. His hand caught the landing gear. His fingers found purchase on the fuselage. He hauled himself up onto the wing as the aircraft lifted off, climbing into the grey alpine sky. Bucky was right behind him. "I told you to stay back," Steve shouted over the wind, "and I ignored you, like always." The plane climbed. Below them the mountains fell away. Ahead lay the Atlantic Ocean, and beyond it the cities of America, sleeping, unsuspecting, trusting that the war was nearly won. They found the bomb bay, found the explosives wired throughout the fuselage, enough firepower to devastate a metropolitan area. And they found what Zemo had promised, a failsafe, a mechanism designed to detonate the payload if anyone attempted to disarm it. "Can you stop it?" Steve asked. Bucky studied the wiring. His face was pale. "Maybe, if I stay here and work on it. But Steve, if this thing goes off while then we find another way." "There is no other way." Bucky's voice was steady, calm. The voice of a man who had already made his decision. Someone has to stay with the bomb, try to defuse it, and someone has to redirect this plane, make sure it doesn't reach its target. "Bucky, the controls are in the cockpit. Go! I'm not leaving you." Bucky grabbed Steve's arm, gripped hard. His eyes were fierce, desperate, filled with everything they had never said to each other across years of war and friendship. "You have to. Steve, listen to me. You're Captain America. You're the symbol. You're what people believe in. I'm just me. If one of us has to make it out of this, it has to be you." "That's not—" "Go!" Bucky pushed him toward the cockpit. "Redirect the plane, ditch it somewhere it can't hurt anyone. And Steve," his voice cracked, "it's been an honor." Steve wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, another path, some miracle that would save them both. But the plane was climbing, and the bomb was ticking, and there was no time. There was never enough time. He went. The cockpit was cramped, the controls designed for automatic operation rather than human piloting. Steve wrestled with the navigation system, overriding Zemo's programming, forcing the plane into a new trajectory. Away from the coast, away from the cities, toward the empty expanse of the North Atlantic. Behind him, he heard Bucky working on the bomb, heard the click of wire cutters, the muffled curses, the desperate race against mechanisms designed to thwart exactly this kind of intervention. Then, the explosion. Not the full payload. Something smaller. A secondary charge, perhaps, triggered by Bucky's attempts to defuse the primary weapon. But enough. Enough to tear through the fuselage. Enough to rip the plane apart. Enough to send Bucky tumbling into the void. Steve screamed his name. lunged toward the breach, saw his best friend falling, silhouetted against grey sky and grey water, growing smaller and smaller until he vanished into the clouds below. Gone. The plane was disintegrating. Fire and wind and the shriek of tearing metal. Steve had seconds to act, seconds to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. He aimed the aircraft toward the water, locked the controls, and then the world turned to ice and darkness and silence. The North Atlantic swallowed Captain America whole. Above, the war continued for a few more weeks. Germany surrendered, Japan followed. The world celebrated victories that Steve Rogers would never see. They searched for his body, sent ships and planes to scour the frigid waters where the drone had gone down. Found nothing but wreckage and ice. Captain America was declared dead, a hero fallen in the final days of the conflict, a symbol martyred for the cause he had championed. But deep beneath the frozen surface, preserved by cold and the impossible resilience of the serum in his veins, Steve Rogers was not dead. He was dreaming of Brooklyn, of Bucky, of a world that was already fading into history, waiting to wake up. The ice held him for decades. 70 years passed in the world above while Steve Rogers drifted in frozen darkness. 70 years of history unfolding without him. Wars fought and won and lost. Empires rising and crumbling. Technologies transforming every aspect of human existence. The atomic age came and went. Men walked on the moon. The Berlin Wall rose and fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Computers shrank from room-sized behemoths to devices that fit in human palms. And through it all, Captain America slept. The serum preserved him. That miraculous compound flowing through his veins prevented the cellular damage that should have killed him within minutes of submersion. His metabolism slowed to nearly nothing. His heart beat perhaps once per hour, pushing blood that moved like cold honey through vessels that refused to freeze completely. He existed in a state between life and death, suspended in ice like an insect trapped in amber, waiting for something to set him free. The Avengers found him by accident. The team was new then, a coalition of extraordinary individuals assembled by the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division to address threats beyond the capacity of conventional forces. They had been tracking an unrelated anomaly in the North Atlantic when their instruments detected something impossible, a human biosignature, faint but unmistakable, emanating from beneath the polar ice. They cut him free with lasers and plasma torches, hauled the frozen block onto their aircraft, watched in disbelief as the ice melted and revealed a figure in tattered red, white, and blue, a figure clutching a round shield that historians had assumed lost forever. Tony Stark was the first to speak. "That's not possible," he said, his voice flat with shock. "That's Captain America. That's actually Captain America." "He's alive," added Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, studying the medical readouts with widening eyes. "Barely, but the readings are clear. He's alive." They rushed him to a medical facility, warmed him slowly, carefully, following protocols that had never been designed for this situation because no one had ever imagined this situation could occur. Doctors monitored his vitals while scientists debated the physics of his survival, and the world held its breath without knowing it should. Steve woke 3 days later. The first sensation was warmth. After so long in the cold, the simple feeling of warm air against his skin was almost overwhelming. Then came sound, beeping machines, humming ventilation, voices speaking in accents he did not recognize. He opened his eyes. The room was wrong. Everything was wrong. The lights were too bright, too steady, lacking the flicker of incandescent bulbs he knew. The machines surrounding his bed looked like props from a science fiction film. The woman sitting beside him wore clothing that belonged to no era he recognized. "Easy," she said, her voice gentle. "You're safe. You're in New York. You've been asleep for a very long time." Steve tried to sit up. His body responded sluggishly, muscles that had not moved in decades protesting the sudden demand. "Where? What year is it?" A pause. The woman exchanged glances with someone outside his field of vision. "It's 2011. The words did not register at first, could not register. 2011. 66 years since he had plunged into the Atlantic. 66 years since Bucky fell. 66 years since everything he knew and loved had existed. Steve pushed himself upright. tore the monitoring leads from his chest. The machine screamed alarms that brought personnel rushing into the room, but he was already moving, through the door, down the corridor, past startled faces and reaching hands. He needed air, needed space, needed to understand what had happened to the world while he was sleeping. He burst through an exit and found himself in Times Square. The assault on his senses was immediate and total. Massive screens blazed with moving images, advertisements, news broadcasts, colours more vivid than any he had ever seen. Crowds surged around him, faces illuminated by the glow of devices he could not identify. The buildings stretched higher than he remembered, their facades covered in lights and signs that shifted and changed as he watched. A taxi honked. A woman bumped into him without apology, her attention fixed on a small glowing rectangle in her hand. Music poured from somewhere, everywhere, overlapping into cacophony. Steve sank to his knees in the middle of the sidewalk. The world had left him behind. Everyone he had known was dead or ancient. Peggy Carter, the woman he had loved, the woman he had promised to dance with, had lived an entire life without him, had married, had children, had grown old while he remained frozen in eternal youth. Howard Stark was dead. The Howling Commandos were dead or dying. Bucky was dead. Bucky was dead. The grief hit him like a physical blow. He had not had time to mourn before, had gone from watching his friend fall to crashing into the ocean in the span of minutes. But now, kneeling on a Manhattan sidewalk while the 21st century roared around him, the loss was absolute. Final. 66 years of finality that could never be undone. Nick Fury found him there. The director of SHIELD was an imposing figure. Tall, dark-skinned, an eye patch covering whatever wound had claimed his left eye. He stood over Steve with an expression that mixed sympathy with calculation, the look of a man who had learned to weaponize compassion. "Captain Rogers," he said, "I'm sorry. I know this isn't the wake-up call you were hoping for." Steve looked up. His voice was hoarse. "The war. Did we win?" "Yeah, we won. Germany surrendered about 2 weeks after you went into the ice. Japan a few months later." Fury offered his hand. "The world owes you a debt it can never repay." Steve took the hand. Let Fury pull him to his feet. Around them the crowd had begun to notice. Phones rising, cameras clicking, whispers spreading. Someone recognized the shield still strapped to his arm, and the whispers became shouts. "We should go," Fury said, "unless you want to explain to every news network on the planet how you're still alive." They retreated to a SHIELD facility. Steve sat in a sterile conference room while Fury explained what had happened in his absence. The Cold War, the fall of communism, the rise of terrorism, the emergence of enhanced individuals and extraterrestrial threats. The world had changed in ways Steve could barely comprehend. But some things, Fury insisted, remained constant. "There are still bullies," the director said. "Still people who want to hurt the innocent, dominate the weak, tear down everything good. The scale has changed. The weapons have changed. But the fight is the same one you signed up for back in 1943. "What are? You asking me?" Fury slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs and dossiers. Tony Stark, heir to Howard's legacy, genius inventor encased in armor of his own design. Thor, actual Norse god, wielder of thunder and lightning. Bruce Banner, scientist cursed to transform into a creature of limitless rage. Natasha Romanoff, spy and assassin, seeking redemption through service. "I'm asking you to lead them," Fury said. "These are the most powerful individuals on the planet, and half of them can barely stand to be in the same room together. They need someone to show them how to be a team, someone they can respect, someone who represents what they're supposed to be fighting for." Steve studied the photographs, saw echoes of the invaders in these modern faces, the same mixture of power and ego, the same potential for greatness and disaster. "Why would they follow me? I'm a relic, a man out of time." "Because you're Captain America," Fury leaned forward. "That still means something. Maybe it means more now than it ever did." Steve thought of Erskine, of the promise he had made in a Brooklyn laboratory a lifetime ago. Stay who you are. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man. He thought of Bucky, falling through grey sky, trusting that Steve would find a way to make his sacrifice matter. He thought of all the people he had lost, all the futures that had been stolen, all the dancing he would never do. And he thought of the bullies still out there, The threats still gathering, the innocent still needing protection. The world had changed, but Stephen Grant Rogers had not. "When do we start?" he asked. Fury smiled. "How about now?" They called themselves Earth's mightiest heroes. It was not humility that kept Steve from embracing the title. It was perspective. He had fought alongside the invaders, alongside Namor, whose strength could crack battleships in half, and the Human Torch, whose flames could incinerate armies. He had seen what mighty looked like. These Avengers were something different. They were chaos wrapped in spandex. Tony Stark was brilliant, perhaps the most intelligent man Steve had ever encountered. His mind operated on frequencies that left ordinary thinkers struggling to keep pace. But brilliance came packaged with arrogance so profound it bordered on pathology. Tony had inherited his father's genius without inheriting Howard's ability to occasionally shut up. He filled every room he entered, every conversation he joined, every silence that might have offered others a chance to speak. Thor was a god, an actual literal deity from the realm of Asgard, wielder of Mjolnir, commander of thunder and lightning. His power was beyond measurement. Steve had watched him shatter mountains with a single blow, summon storms that darken continents, stand against forces that would have annihilated any mortal warrior. But Thor's godhood came with a perspective that struggled to comprehend human concerns. Centuries of life had given him patience that sometimes looked like indifference, and his habit of speaking in proclamations rather than conversations made teamwork challenging. Hank Pym was a genius of a different sort, a biochemist who had discovered particles capable of altering size and mass. As Ant-Man, he could shrink to the dimensions of an insect. As Giant Man, he could grow to heights that dwarfed buildings. His wife, Janet Van Dyne, fought beside him as the Wasp, her size-changing abilities complemented by bioelectric stings that could incapacitate enemies many times her mass. They were formidable, but Hank carried shadows in his psyche that worried Steve, instabilities that seemed to worsen under pressure. Bruce Banner was the most dangerous of them all, though he spent most of his time being the least threatening. The scientist was mild-mannered, soft-spoken, possessed of a gentleness that seemed incompatible with his curse. But when rage took him, when stress or injury or simple bad luck triggered the transformation, he became the Hulk, a creature of limitless strength and limited reason, a force of nature that recognized neither friend nor foe. These were Steve's teammates, his responsibility, his family, whether any of them were ready to admit it. The first months were difficult. The Avengers had existed before Steve's recovery, had fought battles and forged bonds that did not include him. He was an outsider, a relic from another era, inserted into their dynamic by Nick Fury's decree. Tony resented the implication that they needed a leader. Thor was politely bemused by the notion that a mortal could command him. Hank and Janet deferred to Steve's tactical experience, but questioned whether his wartime strategies applied to modern threats. Steve won them over the only way he knew how, by example. The first real test came 3 months after his awakening. Kang the Conqueror, a tyrant from the distant future, armored in technology that made Tony's suits look primitive, launched an invasion of the present. His forces materialized in cities across the globe, overwhelming local defenses with weapons that defied contemporary physics. The Avengers scrambled to respond. Tony coordinated defense grids. Thor engaged Kang's aerial forces. Hank and Janet worked to evacuate civilians from combat zones. But the attacks were too coordinated, too widespread, too perfectly designed to exploit the gaps in Earth's defenses. Steve saw the pattern. Years of studying Nazi tactics, of anticipating Hydra strategies, of learning to read battlefields like texts, all of it crystallized into sudden clarity. Kang was not trying to conquer territory. He was trying to distract. The real target was something else, something the Avengers were too scattered to protect. "Everyone, fall back to the Baxter building," Steve commanded through the comm system. "Kang wants the temporal research stored there. Everything else is misdirection." "You want us to abandon civilians?" Tony's voice crackled with skepticism. "Based on a hunch. Based on 30 years of fighting wars, trust me." A pause. Then Thor's voice, resonant even through electronic distortion. "The captain speaks with the wisdom of a warrior. I will follow." One by one, the others agreed. They converged on the Baxter building just as Kang's primary force revealed itself. A strike team that would have succeeded if the Avengers had remained scattered across the globe. The battle was brutal. Kang fought with the confidence of a man who had already seen history's outcome and knew he would prevail. But history, Steve had learned, was not fixed. It was shaped by those willing to fight for it. His shield took blows that would have killed any normal man. His tactics adapted to technology centuries beyond his experience. And when the moment came, when Kang stood triumphant over fallen Avengers, his victory speech already forming on his lips, Steve threw his shield with every ounce of strength the serum had given him. The vibranium disc struck Kang's temporal gauntlet. The device shattered, and without access to the time stream, the Conqueror was just a man in armor facing a team of Earth's mightiest heroes. They won. They always won, eventually. But what mattered more than the victory was what happened afterward. Tony found Steve on the Baxter Building's roof, staring out at a city that had been saved without knowing it was ever in danger. "That hunch," Tony said, his helmet retracted to reveal the face beneath. "How did you know?" "I didn't know. I read the situation, made a judgment call." "A judgment call that saved the world," Steve shrugged, "is what I do." Tony was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual sardonic edge. "My father talked about you, a lot actually. I used to resent it. Being compared to Captain America, never measuring up to this legend he'd helped create," he paused. "I think I understand now why he admired you so much. Howard was a good man. He was a complicated man, but he was right about you." Tony extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Cap. For real this time." Steve shook the offered hand. Leadership followed naturally after that, not because Steve demanded it, but because the others began deferring to his judgment. He had proven himself in the only currency that mattered: results. The threats escalated. Ultron, an artificial intelligence created by Hank Pym, driven mad by its own existence, launched campaign after campaign against humanity. The robot saw organic life as a plague to be cleansed, and its capacity for self-improvement meant that each defeat only made it stronger. Steve led the Avengers against Ultron's forces in battles that scarred cities and cost lives, each victory temporary, each respite brief. The Masters of Evil assembled, a coalition of villains united by their hatred of the Avengers. Baron Zeo's son, Helmut, inherited his father's vendetta against Captain America and gathered allies capable of matching the team's power. They invaded Avengers Mansion itself, desecrated the home Steve had come to love, beat Hercules half to death, and left Jarvis, the team's loyal butler, broken and bleeding. Steve hunted them down, not with rage. Rage was a luxury soldiers could not afford, but with cold, methodical precision. He dismantled the Masters one by one, saving Helmut Zemo for last, ensuring that the son understood the same lesson the father had learned decades earlier. Captain America did not stay down. The Kree-Skrull War drew Earth into an intergalactic conflict that dwarfed anything Steve had imagined possible. Two alien empires, locked in centuries of mutual annihilation, chose the planet as their battleground. Steve found himself coordinating defences against threats that operated on scales his tactical training had never anticipated. Armadas that blotted out the sun, weapons that could sterilize continents, shapeshifters who could replace anyone without detection. He adapted. He always adapted. That was what soldiers did. But the greatest challenges were not the battles. They were the quieter moments, the decisions made in conference rooms rather than combat zones, whether to trust a reformed villain seeking redemption, whether to sacrifice one life to save thousands, whether to violate sovereignty in pursuit of threats that recognized no borders. Steve made those calls, bore their weight, lost sleep over them, and through it all he trained the next generation. Hawkeye, Clint Barton, came to the Avengers as a reformed criminal, a marksman with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. Steve saw potential beneath the attitude and channeled it into purpose. Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, had served the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants before realizing the error of her allegiance. Her brother Pietro, Quicksilver, followed her into redemption. Steve welcomed them both, seeing echoes of soldiers he had known during the war, people shaped by terrible circumstances, capable of becoming something better if given the chance. They called themselves Cap's Kooky Quartet during the months when the original Avengers took leaves of absence, Steve leading a team of former villains against threats that would have challenged the original lineup. It should not have worked. Every tactical analysis suggested failure. But Steve believed in them, and belief he had learned was its own kind of power, The Avengers became his family. Not a replacement for what he had lost. Nothing could replace Bucky, or the Commandos, or the world that had existed before the ice, but something new. Something that belonged to this era rather than the one he had left behind. He trained with Thor in combat techniques that blended Asgardian tradition with modern efficiency. He argued with Tony over methods and ethics and the proper way to save the world. He mentored young heroes who looked at him with the same awe he had once felt for the soldiers of his father's generation. And slowly, painfully, he began to heal. Not completely. The grief remained, would always remain, a cold weight in his chest that no amount of time could fully thaw. But he learned to carry it, to honour those he had lost by protecting those who remained. That was what Captain America did. That was who Steve Rogers was, Earth's mightiest hero. Not because of the serum, not because of the shield, but because he refused to stop fighting for a world that deserved better than it often received. The intelligence community called him a ghost story, a legend whispered in the dark corners of spy agencies across the globe. Soviet, American, British, Israeli. They spoke of an assassin who had been operating for decades, whose kills spanned generations, whose methods were so precise and so untraceable that many analysts refused to believe a single individual could be responsible. The Winter Soldier. He appeared in the margins of history. A shadowy figure glimpsed in photographs from the Kennedy assassination, though no official record acknowledged his presence. A name mentioned in classified Soviet documents, then redacted, then erased entirely. A pattern of deaths. Politicians, scientists, dissidents, anyone who threatened the interests of powers that preferred to remain nameless, stretching back to the 1950s. When witnesses survived, which was rare, their descriptions were maddeningly inconsistent. Tall, short, dark-haired, light-haired. The only constant was the arm, a prosthetic limb of gleaming metal, articulated with technology that seemed impossible for its era. The arm became his signature, his calling card, the detail that transformed rumour into legend. Steve first encountered the Winter Soldier during an operation in Philadelphia. A SHIELD convoy had been transporting a high-value defector, a former Soviet scientist with knowledge of Cold War weapons programs, that remained classified even decades after the USSR's collapse. The convoy was attacked on a bridge over the Schuylkill River. Professional, surgical. The kind of ambush that left no survivors and no evidence. Except Steve was there. He had been assigned as additional security, a precaution that the mission planners had considered excessive. When the attack came, when the lead vehicle exploded and masked gunmen emerged from seemingly nowhere, Steve was already moving. The battle was chaos. Gunfire and screaming metal, bodies falling and vehicles burning. Steve fought through the attackers with his shield, cutting a path toward the transport vehicle where the defector cowered. He was winning. He was always winning. Then the Winter Soldier stepped out of the smoke. He moved like nothing Steve had seen since the war. Fluid, economical, every motion precise, every strike calculated for maximum effect. The metal arm caught Steve's shield mid-throw and hurled it aside with force that should have been impossible. The assassin followed with a combination of blows that drove Steve backward, each impact resonating through his enhanced physiology. They fought on the burning bridge while the city watched from a distance, shield against arm, super soldier against super soldier. Steve had faced powerful enemies before, but this was different. This opponent matched him, move for move, anticipated his tactics, countered his strategies with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly how he fought. Because he did know. The Winter Soldier's mask was torn loose during the struggle, ripped away by a glancing blow from Steve's shield. The face beneath was older than Steve remembered, hardened by decades of violence, shadowed by traumas Steve could not imagine. But the eyes were the same. Steve froze. The world froze. Everything. The flames, the gunfire, the screaming civilians faded into meaningless background noise. "Bucky?" The Winter Soldier stared at him. No recognition in those eyes. No warmth. Only the cold assessment of a weapon evaluating a target. "Who the hell is Bucky?" he fired. The bullet took Steve in the shoulder, spinning him around. By the time Steve recovered, the Winter Soldier was gone, vanished into the chaos like the ghost story he was supposed to be. But Steve had seen his face, had looked into eyes he had mourned for 70 years. James Buchanan Barnes was alive. The investigation that followed consumed Steve completely. He tore through ACTRA-ELD's archives, demanded access to classified files, called in every favour he had accumulated since his awakening. Nick Fury tried to discourage him, insisted that the Winter Soldier, whoever he had been, was now an enemy, a threat to be neutralised rather than a friend to be saved. Steve did not listen. The truth emerged in fragments, pieces of a nightmare assembled from declassified Soviet documents, intercepted communications, testimony from defectors who had glimpsed the program and survived. Bucky had not died in the fall from the drone plane. The explosion had torn away his left arm and hurled him into the freezing waters below, but it had not killed him. Soviet submarines patrolling the area had recovered his body, had recognized the potential in a specimen that had survived injuries that should have been instantly fatal. They brought him to a facility in Siberia, the Red Room, a program designed to create the perfect assassins, operatives whose loyalty was absolute because their identities had been erased entirely. The procedures were monstrous. They opened his skull and rewired his brain, implanting triggers that allowed handlers to control him with a sequence of spoken words. They replaced his missing arm with a prosthetic of unprecedented sophistication, a weapon in itself capable of crushing steel and deflecting bullets. They froze him between missions, storing him in cryogenic suspension, so that decades passed for the world while only months passed, for their asset, and they sent him to kill. Bucky Barnes, the boy from Brooklyn, the soldier who had fought beside Captain America, the man who had sacrificed himself to save millions, had spent 70 years as a weapon aimed at targets he did not choose. Politicians assassinated in their beds. Scientists murdered before their discoveries could benefit the wrong nations. Dissidents silenced before their words could inspire revolution. Hundreds of kills. Perhaps thousands. A ledger written in blood that stretched across continents and generations. And he remembered none of it. The programming ensured that. After each mission, the handlers would wipe his memory, erasing any trace of personality or connection that might have accumulated during his time awake. They reduced him to a blank slate, a tool without history, a weapon that pointed wherever they aimed it. Steve read the files in a SHIELD, safe house, alone except for his grief. The pages blurred, his hands shook, the horror of what had been done to his friend, the systematic destruction of everything that made Bucky human, was almost too vast to comprehend. But beneath the horror was something else, something fiercer, hope. If Bucky had survived, if some part of him still existed beneath the programming, then he could be saved. The Winter Soldier was a mask, a cage, a prison built from trauma and technology. The man Steve had known was still in there, somewhere. He had to be. Steve made a promise. To himself, to the memory of the friend he had failed to save. He would find Bucky Barnes. He would break through the programming. He would bring him home. The hunt took months. The Winter Soldier had gone to ground after their encounter on the bridge, vanishing into the shadows that had concealed him for decades. Steve tracked leads across 3 continents, safe houses in Prague, weapons caches in Buenos Aires, a network of handlers who scattered like roaches when light found them, and everywhere Steve went. He found evidence of Bucky fighting back. Dead handlers, their necks snapped by a metal hand. Destroyed facilities, their records burned beyond recovery. A trail of violence that suggested the Winter Soldier was hunting his own past, trying to understand what had been done to him. The mask was cracking. They met again in Washington, D.C. Steve had traced Bucky to a Smithsonian exhibit, a memorial to Captain America and the Howling Commandos, complete with photographs and artifacts from the war. He found Bucky standing before a display dedicated to James Buchanan Barnes, staring at his own face from 70 years ago. "I know you," Bucky said without turning around. His voice was hoarse, uncertain, the voice of a man grasping at memories that kept slipping through his fingers. "I know your face. I dream about it sometimes, about falling, about ice. You're Bucky Barnes. You're my friend, my brother." Steve stepped closer. "Whatever they did to you, whatever they made you, do. It wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. I killed people." The words were barely a whisper. "I remember some of them, their faces, the way they looked when they realized what was happening. His metal hand clenched into a fist. I can't make that go away. I can't undo it. No, but you can choose what comes next. Bucky turned. His eyes were wet. The cold efficiency of the Winter Soldier had fractured, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. How? How do I become someone else after everything I've done? Steve thought of Erskine, of a laboratory in Brooklyn, of a frail young man chosen not for his strength but for his character. You don't become someone else. You become who you always were. The programming, the conditioning, that's the mask. The real you is still in there. I've seen him. He's the guy who pulled me out of fights I couldn't win, who followed me into hell because he believed I was worth following, who fell from a plane trying to save millions of people he'd never meet. He extended his hand. Come home, Bucky. Let me help you find your way back. For a long moment, Bucky did not move. The war inside him was visible. Decades of programming battling against fragments of identity that refused to die completely. Then his hand, flesh not metal, reached out and took Steve's. The road to recovery was brutal. The triggers implanted in Bucky's mind could not be removed easily. They required the intervention of the most advanced technology on Earth, including resources provided by Wakanda, a nation whose existence most of the world did not even suspect. The cosmic cube, that artifact of reality-altering power that the Red Skull had sought so desperately, played a role in restoring memories that had been forcibly erased. But technology was only part of the healing. The rest came from something simpler and infinitely more difficult: forgiveness. Bucky had to forgive himself for crimes he had committed without consent, had to accept that the man who pulled those triggers was not entirely him, even as he took responsibility for the consequences, had to build a new identity from the wreckage of the old, neither the innocent soldier of the 1940s nor the hollow weapon of the Cold War. Steve stood beside him through all of it, patient, unwavering, believing in Bucky even when Bucky could not believe in himself, because that was what brothers did. And James Buchanan Barnes, after 70 years of ice and blood and stolen purpose, finally began to find his way home. The explosion killed 612 people. Stamford, Connecticut, a quiet suburb, tree-lined streets and manicured lawns, children riding bicycles, families eating breakfast without any awareness that this morning would be their last. The New Warriors were filming a reality television show. Young heroes, eager for fame, chasing villains who had escaped from the supermax prison known as the Raft. They tracked their quarry to a house in Stamford. Nitro, Cobalt Man, Speed Freaker, Coldheart. Dangerous criminals, but nothing the Warriors believed they could not handle. They were wrong. Nitro possessed the power to explode with the force of a small nuclear device, and more terrifyingly, to reconstitute himself afterward. When Namorita, one of the Warriors, attempted to apprehend him, he detonated. The blast vaporized the house, the neighboring houses, the elementary school 2 blocks away, filled with children who had just begun their morning lessons, 612 dead, 60 of them children. The footage aired on every news network within hours. The bodies were still being recovered when the protests began. Grieving parents demanded answers. Politicians demanded accountability. The public, which had tolerated costumed vigilantes for decades, suddenly saw them as what they had always feared: uncontrolled weapons answerable to no one, capable of destroying communities on a whim, the superhuman. Registration Act was drafted within a week. The legislation was straightforward in its demands and devastating in its implications. All individuals possessing superhuman abilities would be required to register with the federal government. Their identities would be catalogued. Their powers would be documented. They would receive training and operate under government oversight, or they would be classified as criminals and hunted accordingly. For some, the act represented sanity, accountability, the recognition that beings capable of leveling cities should not operate outside the law. Tony Stark became the act's most prominent supporter, arguing that voluntary registration was preferable to the alternatives that might include internment camps, mandatory power suppression, or worse. "We need to get ahead of this," Tony told Steve in the Avengers Tower 3 days after Stamford. "Public opinion is turning against us. If we don't police ourselves, the government will do it, for us. And they won't be gentle." Steve listened. He understood Tony's logic, could see the pragmatism behind it, the calculation of the lesser evils, but he could not accept it. You're asking people to surrender their identities, Steve said, their privacy, their freedom to choose how they use their gifts. You're asking them to trust a government that has proven, repeatedly, that it cannot be trusted with that kind of power. I'm asking them to compromise, to work within the system. The system is broken, Tony. It's always been broken. And giving it more power over people who are different, people who scare the majority, that's not a solution. That's a step towards something much darker. You're being paranoid. I'm being historical. I've seen what happens when governments start registering people they consider dangerous. I've seen the camps, the trains, the chimneys. Steve's voice hardened. I will not help build the architecture for that kind of atrocity, not here, not ever. The argument ended without resolution. It would not be their last. The Superhuman Registration Act passed 3 weeks later. President signed it into law on national television, surrounded by the grieving families of Stamford. Their presence a reminder of why such measures were necessary. Heroes had until midnight to register or face arrest. Tony Stark registered publicly, revealed his identity to the world, not that it had ever been much of a secret, and urged others to follow his example. Reed Richards registered, Hank Pym registered. Many heroes, convinced by Tony's arguments or simply unwilling to become fugitives, lined up to surrender their anonymity. Steve Rogers did not. He stood on the steps of the SHIELD helicarrier, surrounded by agents who'd been ordered to take him into custody, and he refused. I'm not going to fight you, he told Maria Hill, the acting director, but I'm not going to register either. That law is wrong. It violates everything this country is supposed to stand for, and I won't be a part of enforcing it. Then you're a criminal, Captain, and I have orders to bring you in. The agents moved. Steve moved faster. He fought his way off the helicarrier, not to kill, never to kill, but to escape, to remain free, to become the symbol that those who opposed the act so desperately needed. The resistance coalesced around him within days. Heroes who refused to register, some out of principle, some out of fear, some simply because they could not imagine any other path, found their way to Steve Rogers, Luke Cage, Daredevil, Falcon, Hercules, the Young Avengers, dozens of others, their identities concealed, their lives upended, united by their opposition to a law they believed was unjust. They called themselves the Secret Avengers. Steve preferred not to call them anything. Naming things made them real, and he still harboured hope that this conflict could be resolved before it consumed everything he had built. That hope died in pieces. The first battle was in Geffen-Meyer chemical plant. Tony's forces, the registered heroes backed by SHIELD tactical teams, tracked the Secret Avengers to their meeting place and moved to arrest them. What followed was chaos. Friends who had fought side by side against cosmic threats now traded blows with lethal intent. The plant was destroyed, casualties were narrowly avoided, but the precedent was set. Heroes were at war with heroes, the battles multiplied, Times Square, the negative zone. A dozen other locations that became battlegrounds in a conflict that neither side could afford to lose. Tony deployed increasingly extreme measures, including a clone of Thor that malfunctioned and killed Bill Foster, the hero known as Goliath, during a confrontation that should never have happened. Steve attended the funeral in disguise, watched the coffin lowered into a grave 38 feet long, because Bill's body could not be shrunk because the technology had been developed by Tony and Reed, because even in death the registration conflict cast its shadow. He wept, not publicly, not where anyone could see. But alone, in the safe house that served as his headquarters, he wept for a friend who had died because heroes could no longer trust each other. The war ground on. Peter Parker, who had initially supported registration and revealed his identity at Tony's urging, defected to Steve's side after witnessing the excesses of the pro-registration forces. His defection cost him everything. His aunt was shot by an assassin who no longer needed to guess at Spider-Man's civilian identity, and Peter's life collapsed into the same chaos that consumed the entire superhuman community. Villains exploited the conflict. The Thunderbolts, reformed criminals who had been conscripted into government service, were deployed against unregistered heroes, hunting them with the enthusiasm of predators given permission to kill. Lines that had once seemed clear, hero, and villain, right and wrong, blurred into meaninglessness. Steve began to question himself, not his principles. Those remained unshakable. anchored in the same bedrock conviction that had sustained him through the war, through the ice, through every crisis he had faced. But his methods, his tactics, the violence he was unleashing in service of an ideal. He lay awake at night, staring at ceilings in a dozen different safe houses, and wondered if he was still fighting for the people or simply fighting because he did not know how to stop. The final battle came in New York City. Both sides committed everything. Registered heroes and secret Avengers clashed in the streets of Manhattan, their conflicts spilling across blocks, endangering the civilians they had all sworn to protect. Steve fought through Tony's forces with his shield and his fists, driven by something that might have been righteousness, or might have been rage. He reached Tony, beat him, stood over his former friend with the shield raised, ready to deliver a blow that would end the fight once and for all. Then the civilians intervened. Not heroes, not soldiers, ordinary people, firefighters, paramedics, bystanders who had been caught in the crossfire. They grabbed Steve, pulled him away from Tony. Their hands were not strong enough to restrain him. He could have shrugged them off without effort, but their faces stopped him. They were terrified, not of Tony, not of the registration forces, of him, of Captain America, the symbol of everything good and noble, beating a man to death in the street while the city burned around them. Steve looked at his hands, saw the blood, saw what he had become. "What are we doing?" he whispered. The question was not rhetorical. It was genuine, desperate. The question of a man who had been so focused on winning that he had forgotten why he was fighting. He dropped his shield. "Stand down," he ordered his forces. "It's over. We're not fighting for the people anymore. We're just fighting." The arrest was quiet. Steve surrendered without resistance, allowed himself to be shackled, accepted the consequences of choices he had made and actions he could not undo. The war ended, not with victory, not with defeat, but with exhaustion and despair. The Superhuman Registration Act remained law. The registered heroes claimed triumph. The unregistered either submitted or went deeper underground. And Steve Rogers, who had devoted his existence to protecting freedom, found himself in chains. The trial never happened. But the judgment had already been rendered. By himself. Against himself. He had let his principles become more important than the people those principles were meant to protect. It was the most devastating defeat of his life. The cell was clean, functional, the kind of space designed to hold someone without breaking them. White walls, adequate lighting, a cot that was uncomfortable but not cruel. Steve had seen worse accommodations during the war, had slept in foxholes and bombed out buildings and frozen trenches where the ground itself seemed to resent human presence. But those spaces had been temporary, way stations on the path to victory. This cell felt permanent. He spent the days replaying the war in his mind, every decision, every battle, every moment when he could have chosen differently. The faces of those who had followed him haunted his thoughts. The heroes who had trusted his judgment, who had become fugitives and criminals because Steve Rogers told them it was the right thing to do. Had it been? Had any of it been right? The principles remained clear. Registration was wrong. Government control of superhuman identity was a step toward persecution. History supported this analysis. Every atrocity began with lists, with categories, with a separation of us from them. But principles, Steve was learning, could become prisons of their own. He had clung so tightly to what he believed that he had lost sight of what mattered. The people, the protection of innocent lives, the simple human goodness that had made him worthy of the serum in the first place. Tony visited once. They sat across a table in an interrogation room, guards standing at attention, the weight of everything unsaid filling the silence between them. "I didn't want this," Tony said finally. "Any of this." "I know. The act. I still believe it was necessary. Still believe we need accountability." He paused. "But the way it happened, the things we did to each other. Bill Foster." His voice cracked slightly. "I dream about that sometimes. The sound the clone made when it... Don't." Steve's voice was gentle. "Don't torture yourself with what can't be changed. Trust me. I've tried. It doesn't help." They sat in silence for a long moment. "What happens now?" Tony asked. Steve shook his head. "Trial, I suppose. Then prison. Maybe they'll build a special cell for me. Something with stars and stripes on the walls. No. Steve met Tony's eyes. Whatever happens, I accept it. I made my choices. I'll live with the consequences. Tony nodded slowly, rose to leave. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, you were right. About the principles. About what registration could become. He turned back. I just couldn't see another way. There's always another way, Steve said. We just have to be brave enough to find it. Tony left. The guards escorted Steve back to his cell. The trial date was set for the following week. Captain America would face justice in the country he had spent his life protecting. He was ready. What he was not ready for was what came next. The morning of the trial dawned grey and cold. Steve dressed in the clothes they had provided. A simple suit, navy blue, the kind of anonymous attire that lawyers recommended for defendants seeking to appear respectable. No costume, no shield. Just a man facing judgment in a system he had always believed in, even when that system turned against him. The transfer from the detention facility to the federal courthouse required a convoy of armoured vehicles, a helicopter escort, and more security personnel than most heads of state commanded. The authorities were taking no chances. Captain America had escaped custody before. They would not allow him the opportunity again. Not that Steve had any intention of escaping. He sat in the back of the transport vehicle, wrists bound in restraints designed to hold superhuman prisoners, and watched the streets of New York pass through the reinforced windows. The city looked the same as it always had. The same towering buildings, the same rivers of traffic, the same humanity flowing through concrete canyons in pursuit of lives he could barely imagine. The world had continued without him during his decades in the ice. It would continue without him now. The courthouse steps were chaos. Hundreds of people had gathered, supporters and protesters, journalists and curious bystanders, a mass of humanity, drawn by the spectacle of a fallen hero facing justice. Signs waved above the crowd. Some demanded Steve's imprisonment. Others proclaimed his innocence. Still others bore messages that had nothing to do with registration or civil war, simple declarations of love for a symbol that had meant something to them. Captain America is a hero, lock him up, thank you. Cap traitor. Steve read them all as the transport doors opened. Read them and felt the weight of every expectation, every projection, every dream that strangers had attached to his image. He had never asked to be a symbol, had only wanted to serve, but symbols, once created, belonged to everyone who believed in them. The security detail formed around him, federal marshals in body armor, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the crowd for threats. They moved Steve toward the courthouse entrance with the efficiency of professionals who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. They had not rehearsed for Crossbones. Brock Rumlow had been Hydra's most reliable operative for decades, a mercenary whose loyalty to the organization was matched only by his capacity for violence. He had worked with the Red Skull on operations spanning continents, had killed on command without hesitation or remorse, had built a reputation as someone who always completed his assignments. Today's assignment was the most important of his career. He lay on a rooftop 300 yards from the courthouse, his rifle steady, his breathing controlled. The scope's crosshairs tracked Captain America's progress through the crowd. The blonde hair, the broad shoulders, the bearing of a soldier even in civilian clothes. An easy shot for someone of Rumlow's skill, almost insultingly easy. He waited for the signal. Sharon Carter stood in the crowd below, dressed as a civilian, her credentials identifying her as a freelance journalist covering the trial. No one questioned her presence. No one noticed the slight glassiness in her eyes, the mechanical quality of her movements, the way she responded to stimuli a half-second slower than a normal person would. She was not herself. Dr. Faustus had spent weeks inside her mind, rewriting her loyalties, implanting commands that she could not resist or even recognize. The Red Skull had orchestrated every detail, had planned this moment with the same meticulous cruelty he brought to all his schemes against Captain America. Sharon Carter, the woman Steve loved, would be the instrument of his destruction. Poetic, the Skull had called it. Appropriate. Steve reached the base of the courthouse steps. The crowd pressed closer, straining against the barriers, reaching toward him with hands that wanted to touch, to harm, to bless. He paused, just for a moment, just long enough to meet some of their eyes, to acknowledge the people who had come to witness whatever this day would bring. That pause saved his life, briefly. Crossbones fired. The bullet took Steve in the shoulder, spinning him around, sending him staggering against the marshals who tried to catch him. Blood sprayed across the grey concrete. The crowd screamed, a sound like the ocean during a storm, primal and overwhelming. The security detail scrambled to identify the shooter, to shield their prisoner, to impose order on sudden chaos. Steve fell to one knee. The pain was distant, filtered through the adrenaline flooding his system. He had been shot before, had survived wounds that would have killed ordinary men. This was bad, but not fatal. He could. Sharon was there. She had pushed through the chaos, through the panicking crowd and the scrambling marshals, moving with purpose toward the wounded man on the courthouse steps. Her face was familiar, beloved. The face Steve had dreamed about during his years in the ice, the face that had been waiting for him when he awoke. Older, but still beautiful, still carrying the fierce intelligence that had drawn him to her grandmother and then to her. He smiled when he saw her. Even bleeding on the concrete, even surrounded by chaos, even facing judgment for choices he still believed were right, he smiled because Sharon was there. "Sharon," he said, "you shouldn't be." She raised the pistol. Some part of her screamed. Some buried fragment of Sharon Carter, trapped behind walls of conditioning and chemical manipulation, recognized what her hands were doing and tried to stop them. But Faustus had been thorough. The Red Skull had been thorough. The commands were absolute. She fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The bullets entered Steve's chest at close range, tore through tissue and bone, found his heart. That strong heart, strengthened by the serum capable of pumping blood through a body that had survived impossible traumas, and stopped it. Steve looked at Sharon. His eyes held no accusation, no anger, only confusion, and beneath that something that might have been understanding. "Sharon," he whispered. Blood bubbled at his lips. "It's okay. It's not your—" He did not finish the sentence. Stephen Grant Rogers, Captain America, the kid from Brooklyn who had stood up to bullies his entire life, died on the courthouse steps with the woman he loved standing over him and a gun still smoking in her hand. The world stopped. Not literally. The earth continued its rotation. The sun continued its arc across the sky. But for millions of people, for everyone who had ever believed in what Captain America represented, time seemed to fracture, to become meaningless, to collapse into a single impossible moment. Captain America was dead. The news spread faster than the authorities could contain it. Cell phone footage captured the assassination from a dozen angles. The shots, the fall, the blood pooling on grey concrete. Within minutes, the images were everywhere. Within hours, the world knew. Flags flew at half-staff. Not by official order. The government that had imprisoned Steve could hardly mourn him publicly, but by the choice of ordinary citizens who remembered what he had meant to them. Veterans who had served in wars he inspired. Children who had grown up with his image on their walls. Immigrants who had seen in his story a reflection of their own. The outsider who became the embodiment of American ideals. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Full military honours, despite the controversy surrounding his final days. Whatever crimes the government had accused him of, Stephen Rogers remained a decorated veteran of World War II, a hero who had saved the world before most of the current administration had been born. Tony Stark delivered the eulogy. His voice broke 3 times. He spoke of friendship and failure, of principles that divided them and respect that endured despite division. He spoke of a man who had never stopped believing in the possibility of a better world, even when that world seemed determined to disappoint him. He was the best of us, Tony said, not because of the serum, not because of the shield, because of who he chose to be, every single day, no matter what it cost him. The heroes gathered, Avengers and X-Men, Fantastic Four and Defenders, allies and rivals united in grief for someone they had all admired, even when they disagreed with his choices. They stood in silence as the casket was lowered, as the rifles fired their salute, as the flag was folded and presented to no one. Because Steve had no family, no next of kin, only the family he had chosen and the nation he had served. Sharon Carter was not present. She had been taken into custody immediately after the shooting, her conditioning discovered within hours. The truth, that she had been weaponized by the Red Skull, that she had killed the man she loved without consent or awareness, would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Red Skull's involvement became clear in the weeks that followed, even apparently destroyed, even scattered across dimensions by his latest failed scheme, the Skull, had reached out from whatever hell contained him and struck at Captain America one final time. The hatred that had defined their rivalry transcended death itself. But death, Steve had always known, was not the end. In his quarters, Bucky Barnes found a letter. Steve had written it before the trial, had arranged for its delivery in the event of his death. The words were simple, direct, the words of a soldier who knew that every mission might be his last. The shield is yours now, not because you're the only one who can carry it. There are others who could, others who will, but because I trust you, because I know that whatever darkness you've walked through, the man I called brother is still in there. Be Captain America, not me. Be the Captain America you were meant to be. And when the time comes, pass the shield to someone else who deserves it. That's how we win, Buck. Not by being immortal, by being replaceable, by building something bigger than any one of us. I believe in you. I always have. Your friend, Steve Bucky, read the letter 7 times. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket, and went to find the shield. Captain America was dead. Long live Captain America. The shield felt wrong in his hands. Bucky Barnes stood in the ruins of what had once been Steve's apartment, holding the circular disc of vibranium that had defined Captain America for generations. It was lighter than he remembered, or perhaps his metal arm simply made everything feel lighter. The weight that pressed down on him had nothing to do with physical mass. He was not worthy of this. He knew it with a certainty that bordered on self-destruction. The Winter Soldier had killed innocents, had served monsters, had been a weapon aimed at everything Steve Rogers stood for. The blood on his hands would never wash clean, no matter how many times he scrubbed. But Steve had asked. The letter was still in his pocket. The words burned into his memory. The shield is yours now. Not because you're the only one who can carry it, but because I trust you. Trust. After everything Bucky had done, after all the years of being Hydra's attack dog, Steve still trusted him, still believed that the man who had pulled him out of Brooklyn alleyways existed somewhere beneath the programming and the trauma. Bucky did not share that belief, but he would honor it. The new Captain America emerged 3 weeks after Steve's funeral. The costume was different, darker. The blue was deeper, almost black in certain lights. The star on the chest seemed less like a symbol of hope and more like a target. Appropriate, Bucky thought, for someone who expected to die wearing it. He carried the shield in his left hand, the metal arm providing grip that no human limb could match, and on his right hip he carried a gun. The choice was deliberate, provocative. Steve had never used firearms as Captain America, had relied on the shield alone, had refused to take lives when any other option existed. Bucky did not have that luxury. The Winter Soldier had been trained to kill efficiently, and Bucky could not simply forget those skills. More importantly, he did not believe he should. Captain America needed to be willing to do what was necessary. Steve had been an ideal. Bucky would be something else. The public reaction was mixed. Some embraced the new Captain America, saw in his harder edge a reflection of harder times, an acknowledgement that the world had changed and its symbols needed to change with it. Others rejected him utterly. Captain America was Steve Rogers. Anyone else wearing the costume was an insult to his memory. Bucky ignored both camps. He had not taken the shield to be popular. He had taken it because Steve asked him to, and because the threats facing the world did not pause to mourn fallen heroes. He fought, endlessly it seemed. Hydra cells that had gone to ground after Steve's death, emboldened by the belief that their greatest enemy was finally destroyed. AIM scientists pursuing technologies that could reshape reality. Remnants of the Red Skull's network, still operating in shadows, still dreaming of the Master's return. Bucky dismantled them all, with the shield, with the gun, with the skills that Hydra had beaten into him, now turned against everything Hydra represented. It was not redemption. Bucky did not believe in redemption. Not for himself, not after what he had done. But it was purpose, direction, A reason to wake up each morning that did not involve putting a bullet through his own skull. And then Steve came back. The science was complicated. Something about the bullets that killed him. They had not merely ended his life but displaced him in time, scattering his consciousness across his own history. Steve had spent what felt like years reliving his past, experiencing moments he had forgotten, fighting to reassemble himself and return to the present. The details mattered less than the result. Stephen Grant Rogers, alive and whole, standing in a SHIELD medical facility, while doctors struggled to explain the impossible. Bucky was the first person he asked to see. They met in a room that had been cleared of monitoring equipment, a courtesy extended by Nick Fury, who understood that some conversations needed to happen in private. Steve sat on the edge of a hospital bed, wearing clothes that did not quite fit, looking exactly as he had the day he died. Bucky stood by the door, the shield strapped to his back, unable to bridge the distance between them. "You came back," Bucky said finally. His voice was hoarse. "You actually came back. Apparently dying isn't as permanent as it used to be." Steve's smile was tired but genuine. "I hear you've been busy." Someone had to be. Bucky reached back, unstrapped the shield, held it between them like an offering. "This belongs to you." Steve did not take it. "I watched you," he said. "Well, I was wherever I was. I saw fragments of the present, saw what you were doing." He met Bucky's eyes. "You've been a good Captain America, Buck. Different from me, but good. I'm not you. No, you're not, and that's exactly why you should keep the shield." Bucky stared at him. "Steve? The world doesn't need me to be Captain America right now. It needs you. Someone who understands that the threats we face can't always be solved with inspiration and hope. Someone who's willing to make the hard calls." Steve stood, crossed the distance between them, placed his hands on Bucky's shoulders. "I'll still fight, still serve. But the shield, that's yours now. Earn it. Every day in whatever way makes sense to you. And if I fail, then you get up and try again. That's all any of us can do." Steve took on a new role, Commander Rogers, they called him, leading special operations teams, coordinating responses to threats that required his tactical expertise without requiring the symbol of the shield. It was a compromise, an acknowledgement that Captain America was larger than any individual. Bucky continued carrying that weight, continued fighting, bleeding, questioning whether he deserved the legacy he had inherited. Some days the answer was no. Some days the answer did not matter, because the threats did not care about his psychological state. Years passed. The shield changed hands again. Sam Wilson had been Steve's partner for nearly a decade. The Falcon, a former pararescueman who had found new purpose fighting alongside Captain America. When Steve finally returned to active duty, Sam had been there. When Steve stepped back again, Sam had been there. He was always there, steady and reliable in ways that the world desperately needed. When Steve asked him to take the shield, Sam hesitated. "I'm not a super soldier," he said. "I don't have the serum, I'm just—" "You're exactly what Captain America needs to be," Steve interrupted. "Someone who earned everything they have. Someone who fights because it's right, not because they're indestructible." He pressed the shield into Sam's hands. "The shield doesn't make Captain America. The person holding it does." Sam Wilson became a different kind of Captain America. He faced challenges Steve had never encountered. Questions about what the symbol meant when worn by a black man, about whether America deserved a captain at all, about the distance between the nation's ideals and its reality. He carried the weight of representation, along with the weight of the shield, and he carried both with grace. The pattern repeated. The shield passed from hand to hand, each bearer bringing something unique to the legacy, each one struggling with the same fundamental question. What does it mean to be Captain America? Steve watched, advised when asked, fought when needed. But increasingly, he understood that his role was not to be Captain America forever. His role was to ensure that Captain America endured, that the ideal outlasted any individual, that the symbol remained, powerful regardless of who wore the costume. Because that was the point. That had always been the point. Erskine had not chosen Steve because he was special. He had chosen Steve because he was good, and goodness was not unique. It existed in countless people, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be given the chance to flourish. The serum had amplified what was already inside Steve Rogers. The shield could amplify what was inside anyone brave enough to carry it. Captain America was not a person. Captain America was a promise that someone would always stand against tyranny, that someone would always protect the innocent, that someone would always refuse to back down, no matter how powerful the bully, no matter how impossible the odds. Steve Rogers had made that promise as a frail young man in a Brooklyn tenement, decades before the serum or the shield or any of the battles that would define his legend. He had made it every time he stood up after being knocked down, every time he refused to run from fights he could not win, every time he chose principle over safety. The promise had not changed, only the scale. In the final accounting, Steve understood that was his legacy, not the victories, though there had been many, not the battles, though they had been countless, not even the inspiration he had provided to generations of heroes who followed in his footsteps. His legacy was the idea itself, the belief that one person standing firm could change the world. That courage was more powerful than strength, that the measure of a hero was not the body they wore, but the choices they made. He had been born small and sick and poor, in a tenement apartment on the 4th of July. He had lost everything: his parents, his health, his best friend, his era, his life. He had been frozen and thawed, killed and resurrected, celebrated and condemned. Through all of it, he had remained Steve Rogers, the kid from Brooklyn, the boy who stood up to bullies, and as long as there were bullies in the world, as long as there was injustice and cruelty and the strong preying upon the weak, there would be a Captain America to stand against them. The shield endured, the legend endured, the promise endured. That was enough. That was everything. That was the story of Captain America.